Hey guys, tonight we slip into a kind of quiet most people never hear anymore, the kind that makes your ears ring because nothing else is making sound. You're standing at the edge of a lake so still it looks like poured glass, and the air is so crisp it feels like it could snap in your hands. A float plane has just lifted away behind you, shrinking into the pale Alaskan sky, its engine fading until it's nothing but a memory. And now it hits you. There is no road back, no last-minute Uber rescue, no friendly ranger offering a map. It's just you, the trees, the cold, and a silence that has weight. Somewhere out here, a man once built a life from absolute scratch, staying long enough that seasons blurred into years, and years into decades. He didn't come for glory or YouTube thumbnails, he came because something inside him needed to test what life becomes when you strip every convenience away. You probably wouldn't survive. This most modern folks panic when the Wi-Fi dips for 30 seconds, but that's the fun of imagining it from your warm bed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing the little constellation of night owls listening in from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take that first hesitant step away from the lakefront, your boots sinking just a little into the mossy ground. The air smells of spruce resin and cold river water, clean in a way that feels almost medicinal. Everything around you carries that slightly oversized Alaskan dramatic flair, the mountains sharper, the trees taller, the sky somehow bigger than the sky you grew up with. This is the place he chose to live alone for 30 years, and already you can feel the pull of it. You drag a hand along the rough bark of the spruce tree just to anchor yourself, because the silence is starting to play tricks. Historians still argue whether long-term isolation rewires the brain permanently, or merely lowers the volume of civilization until your own thoughts echo louder. But you're about to find out for yourself. The fringe tidbit scholars like to whisper about is the Alaskan hush, a phenomenon where intense quiet makes some people feel euphoric and others feel like they're being watched. Which mood you fall into? Well, that depends on how brave your imagination is. From here, the terrain stretches like a rumpled green blanket, broken only by the icy blue sheen of the lake. Farther out, you spot faint smoke stains on the horizon, old burn scars from wildfires decades ago. One mainstream historical fact: Alaska's wildfire cycles have shaped its landscape for millennia, clearing forests in brutal waves and making every open meadow you see a testament to past destruction. But in this moment, all you feel is vulnerability. No roads, no houses, no convenience stores with emergency granola bars, just a huge landscape that doesn't care you're here. The floatplane's departure feels like a door slamming shut behind you. You adjust your pack, more out of nervous habit than necessity. Inside, there's not much, just the basic things he might have carried on his first day. A simple knife, some rope, maybe a tin for boiling water. Not survival gear so much as, well, let's see what happens gear. And even that feels strangely heavy in your hands. You start walking the shoreline, each step crunching small, pale stones. You half expect some big Alaskan creature to appear: a bear, a moose, maybe a disgruntled salmon, but nothing moves except a lone raven perched on a dead limb. Its eyes track you with that judgmental, "You sure about this?" stare. Ravens out here are famously intelligent. One quirky fact: some locals swear individual birds recognize humans and remember their faces for years. You wave awkwardly at it, because starting a bad relationship with a bird that smart seems unwise. The raven croaks once, unimpressed, and flaps away. The forest tightens around you as you step off the beach. The trail isn't a real trail. It's more like a suggestion of one, created by the faint memory of his boots passing decades ago. Branches snag your sleeves. Wet moss muffles your footfalls. Every sound you make, even a quiet breath, ricochets in your own ears. There's something grounding about it, though. The wilderness strips away all the filler noise of daily life. No traffic, no notifications pinging, no neighbors rehearsing their garage band breakup songs. Just the subtle choir of wind, water, and whatever creature is pretending it's not watching you. And as you walk, you start to understand why he came here. The simplicity is seductive. Every moment feels honest. You're not juggling schedules or messages, or the weird pressure to stay updated. You just exist. You feel wind brush your cheek and you actually notice it. You hear twigs snap behind you and your brain perks up instead of dismissing it as a car door 3 houses down. There's a point in the path where the forest opens into a clearing, a raw, uneven patch of land edged by tall fireweed and blueberry bushes. And that's when you see it. The faint base logs of a structure long since reclaimed by time. Maybe the stones of a fire pit. Maybe the outline of where his first shelter once stood. Historians still argue whether his earliest construction was improvised or meticulously planned, but the mystery is part of the charm. You kneel, brushing away a layer of leaves, revealing cold, grey wood preserved by the dry climate. A small joke slips through your mind. Great, found the world's least convenient fixer-upper. You sit on one of the logs, letting the space breathe around you. You can imagine him pacing this clearing, deciding where the door should face, judging sunlight angles, listening to the wind like it was offering advice. You feel the ghost of that decision-making process the moment he committed to staying. It's an emotional weight, heavier than your pack. Because staying here means giving up dozens of tiny modern comforts you've never questioned. Hot showers, microwaves, a fridge that doesn't hold grudges. You look across the lake again, letting the late evening gold bleed across the water. Somewhere deep inside you, a subtle shift begins, the sense that maybe, just maybe, you could stay here longer than a few minutes without panicking. But the real test is still ahead. You stand slowly from the half-rotted log, dusting off your hands, and for a moment you picture the man who once stood here alone, decisive, and probably wondering whether he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. But you don't get time to linger in that thought, because now you're looking at the same tangled trees he once faced, trying to imagine how you'd build even a basic shelter out of them. Spoiler: if your woodworking experience consists solely of assembling IKEA furniture, you're about to discover new levels of humility. You take a few steps toward the tree line, running your fingers along a sapling just thick enough to cut. The wood has that faint resin smell that sticks to your gloves and somehow to your soul. This is where he started. No power tools, no stacks of kiln-dried lumber, no hardware store with a sleepy teenager at the register who doesn't know the difference between a screw and a bolt. Just trees, a hand saw, a borrowed axe, and an absurd amount of patience. Historians still argue whether his first cabin design was inspired by older frontier manuals or just intuitive copying of old trapper shelters, but the result was impressively solid. Mainstream fact: frontier-style log cabins weren't romantic at all. They were utilitarian boxes, built quickly to survive storms, not Instagram, reels. And when you look around now, you see why. The wind shifts suddenly across the lake, and the air drops from refreshing chill to concerningly sharp. Out here, shelter isn't optional, it's obedience to the weather. You trace the outline of the former foundation again, imagining how he measured the logs by pacing them out, by eye, by instinct. You bend to lift one old base log, realizing instantly how impossibly heavy it is, even after decades of drying. Yeah, you mutter under your breath. I'm definitely hiring a contractor. Joke number one: your ego needs it. You step back, mentally reverse engineering the original structure. The logs weren't cut to perfect length. He notched them by hand with an embarrassing amount of trial and error. The corners had that interlocking saddle notch style that frontier builders loved because it required fewer nails. Not that he had nails. He used wooden pegs in some sections, a fringe tidbit scholars mention as evidence of extreme resourcefulness. And when you look close enough at the wood, you can still see faint indentation marks where the notches once met. The sun dips slightly, brushing the treetops with a warmer gold. You breathe out, imagining the rhythm of it. Chop, drag, notch, lift, repeat about 200 times. You wouldn't just be tired. You'd invent whole new varieties of tired. You'd create fatigue flavors. You walk through the clearing, imagining the next phase, raising the walls. He did it alone, which is one of those facts that sounds impossible until you realize humans under pressure can do things modern office life has politely erased from our DNA. Historians still argue whether he used makeshift levers, stacking systems, or sheer stubbornness. But based on the logs still lying here, you can guess stubbornness played a healthy role. You move toward the lake, following where he'd drag each tree down from the hillside. Your boots slide slightly on a patch of damp moss, and you catch yourself before landing spectacularly on your back. Great, you whisper. I've been here an hour, and nature already has me on thin ice. Joke number two: but fair Alaska is not subtle. At the waterline, you crouch to touch the lake, and the cold stings your skin instantly. This would have been his drinking water, his washing water, his everything water. He boiled it in a battered tin until it was safe. Mainstream fact: many early wilderness settlers relied entirely on lake water boiled over open fires because filtration systems didn't exist yet or weren't portable. And he followed that tradition almost religiously. You cup a handful of water and let it slip through your fingers, imagining how comforting that warm steam must have felt rising from his pot after hours of chopping and hauling. Turning back, you try to envision the roof going up. It wasn't shingled. It was covered in hand-split shakes or sometimes sod layers of soil and grass that insulated the cabin surprisingly well. One fringe tidbit you've probably never heard: sod roofs can sprout flowers if enough sunlight reaches them. No one knows whether his ever did, but the idea of a tiny garden growing above him feels strangely poetic. When you step back into the clearing, the world feels bigger now that you're picturing yourself building something within it. You run a hand along one of the foundation logs again. The wood is cool, slightly rough, and so solid you can hardly imagine what it took to place it there in the first place. Then a raven swoops low overhead again, cawing loudly, almost like it's mocking your hesitation. All right, you tell it. I get it. You're better suited for this. Joke number 3, balanced humor quota achieved. You turn slowly in a circle, absorbing the scale of the space. Every tree around you once represented hours of labor. Every log meant dragging weight equal to your entire body across uneven ground. And every notch cut meant he was committing not to a weekend project, not to a survival challenge, but to a life. The breeze picks up again, lifting the fireweed in small waves. For a moment, you close your eyes, letting the sound wash over you. The soft hiss of wind through spruce needles, the distant splash of a fish somewhere out on the lake, the faint groan of a tree trunk settling. You open your eyes and picture him laying the first roof beam, shoulders burning, breath misting in the cold evening light. It must have taken days, maybe weeks, but eventually he stood inside a space that finally felt like a home, even if it was just 4 walls and a roof. And now? Only ghosted outlines remain, but the energy of the effort hangs here, quiet and patient. You feel it like a shadow of hard work brushing your skin. You take one step toward the tree line again, realizing you're about to learn what it felt like to wake up in a place no one else could hear you breathe. You wander back toward the trees, and the moment you cross that soft boundary of spruce and shadow, the silence settles on you heavier than the pack on your shoulders. It isn't the gentle hush of a library or the calming quiet of your room at 2 a.m. No, this is a silence with shape, with temperature, with presence. It presses against your ears like soft hands, and for a second you swear it makes your heartbeat sound louder, thudding like you're walking around with a tiny drum inside your chest. This is the world he stepped into day after day, the kind of quiet that scrapes the noise of civilization out of your brain until you start hearing all the things you usually ignore. Your own breath feels exaggerated. Your backpack straps creak louder. Even the faint pop of a twig under your boot echoes like you've committed some grand acoustic crime. And while it's peaceful, there's something a little unnerving too. Joke number 1. You briefly consider apologizing to the forest for stepping too loudly, just to stay on its good side. You walk deeper, letting the world dim around you. Light filters through the branches in wavering columns, dust motes drifting like lazy fireflies. For the first time, you understand why long-term wilderness dwellers write about silence as if it's a living companion. Historians still argue whether prolonged isolation sharpens perception or simply tricks the brain into amplifying subtle sensations, but either way, you're feeling it now. A mainstream fact: interior Alaska is one of the quietest inhabited regions on Earth. Researchers measuring natural soundscapes note that some valleys and lakes record noise levels so low they're close to the threshold of human hearing. That's part of why he chose this place. Its quiet wasn't an occasional gift. It was a constant condition. The path narrows, branches knit overhead, creating a kind of cathedral made of needles and light. And standing in that space, you become painfully aware of the sounds you are bringing. Your zipper rattles. Your foot scuffs a root. Your jacket sleeve whispers as it brushes your pack strap. You've never felt so noisy. The forest around you feels like it's holding its breath, waiting to see if you'll learn to match its rhythm. You try it. You stand still, really still. A long inhale, a slow exhale, and the silence shifts again, not gone, but tuning itself to you, like the forest is adjusting the volume. That's when you finally hear it. The tiny crackle of frost melting on a leaf, the distant drip of lake water falling from a mossy rock, and somewhere far beyond, the faintest rush of wind moving through treetops dozens of yards away. You smile. It's subtle magic, a quirky fringe tidbit many wilderness hermits mention. In deep silence, some people claim they can hear the snow sound, a soft, crystalline hiss created by settling ice particles. Scientists debate whether it's real or just a trick of the mind, but out here, you wouldn't be surprised if the snow has secrets of its own. You keep walking until the forest opens into a smaller clearing dotted with boulders. You sit on one, feeling its chill seep through your pants, and close your eyes again, not to sleep, just to sense what he sensed. And here's where the silence becomes something else entirely. It starts to feel like a mirror, not a reflection of your body, but your mind. All the little thoughts you usually drown out with noise notifications, chatter, traffic, videos bubble up one by one. Worries, memories, plans you haven't made yet. Even the random, useless things like that one embarrassing moment from years ago your brain loves to resurrect at 2 a.m. The wilderness doesn't erase your mind. It invites it to stretch out, take up space, wander around barefoot. It's uncomfortable, but also liberating. You imagine him sitting right where you are, maybe after hours of chopping or hauling. No podcasts, no playlists, no background noise, just pure, mental quiet, interrupted only by the occasional raven or the distant cracking of lake ice in the winter. You can see how a man could grow addicted to this. A breeze shifts through the trees again, and the air brushes your face with that crisp, pine-laced chill. You shiver not from cold, but from the weight of the solitude. This is silence that can comfort you one moment and challenge you the next. That duality is why historians still argue whether long-term hermits become calmer or simply grow more dependent on silence to think clearly. You hop off the boulder and take a slow lap around the clearing. This silence changes you. It makes your movements gentler, more deliberate. You step carefully, not wanting to break the fragile acoustic stillness that has formed around you. A squirrel darts up a tree, making the branches tremble a tiny noise, but it feels startlingly loud. "Hey, buddy," you whisper to it, because talking to animals feels normal in a place like this. You're the noisiest thing in Alaska right now. Joke number 2, nature is clearly unfazed. As you walk, you realize something else. The lack of human voices creates a weird cognitive shift. Your inner monologue gets louder, sharper, more organized. All those little background thoughts you usually ignore now assemble themselves like they're auditioning for a TED Talk. It gives you a taste of why journal entries from wilderness dwellers often read like philosophical essays. Silence makes thinkers out of people who didn't intend to think. One mainstream debate among psychologists is whether silence boosts creativity or simply exposes the creativity that was already hiding under life's daily commotion. Out here, you're inclined to believe the latter. The forest hasn't changed you, it's just handed you a giant, empty mental canvas and said, "Go ahead, paint whatever you want." You pause again, staring up through the canopy. The branches sway gently, as if waving at the sky, and sunlight blinks between gaps like someone signaling with mirrors. You breathe in deeply, and the cold air slides into your lungs like mint. A third joke slips out quietly, half murmured. "If the silence gets any louder, I'm gonna need earplugs." Humor helps, even here. Finally, you step back into the clearing's center, letting the quiet wrap all the way around you. This is where he learned to adapt not to sound, but to the lack of it. And slowly, you understand that silence wasn't just an environmental feature for him. It was a companion, a teacher, a backdrop, and eventually, a necessity. You take one last breath, grounding yourself. Because the silence is about to follow you everywhere, from the first cabin logs to the long winter nights ahead. You move back toward the lake, letting the trees thin out until you emerge once more into open light. The air feels different now, not louder, but wider, like the silence you just walked through left an imprint on your skin. And as you stand there, breathing in that cold clarity, you begin to sense the rhythm he once built his entire life around. A routine not based on alarms, calendars, or work schedules, but on the subtle cues of light, wind, and instinct. Out here, routine isn't an option, it's the backbone that keeps you alive. You take a few slow steps toward the water's edge, and imagine waking up in this place every single morning. No buzzing phone, no morning news, no traffic soundtrack, just the soft frost clinging to the windows of a log cabin, a breath clouding the air, and the quiet obligation to get moving before the cold decides your fate for the day. One mainstream historical fact. Early Alaskan homesteaders woke with the sun and slept with it too, because artificial light was limited and, honestly, fighting the natural rhythm of the wilderness was a losing battle. You feel that now. The light tells your body what to do. You picture yourself crawling out of a rough wooden bunk, pulling on cold boots, and stepping outside into air that stings your cheeks. And you get why his routine had to be carved out of necessity. Fetch water, chop wood, check traps, split more wood, eat something simple, repair what broke yesterday. And yes, split more wood, because the wilderness has a personal vendetta against anyone with warm fingers. You kneel and pick up a small stone, turning it in your hand. You imagine him pacing this shoreline at dawn, scanning the sky, the horizon, the gentle motion of the lake. Out here, a routine begins not with tasks, but with observation. The color of the clouds decides whether you hunt or stay close. The way the wind hits the trees decides whether you venture onto the water. Even the pressure in your own bones, something modern people often ignore, becomes a weather forecast. You stand, brushing dirt from your palm, and follow the faint path back toward the clearing where his cabin once stood. You imagine the day unfolding. The quiet scrape of a tin cup on a wooden table. The hiss of water hitting a hot pan. The smell of something simple cooking oatmeal, maybe fish. Maybe the same meal he ate yesterday and the day before. Historians still argue whether routine strengthens the mind or dulls it. But in a place where survival is the priority, predictability becomes a kind of comfort food. A quirky fringe tidbit that always surfaces in wilderness journals. Many long-term hermits report naming parts of their daily tasks as if they were co-workers. There are accounts of people calling their stoves Old Rusty, their favorite axe Gertrude, and their water bucket the Reliable One. You look at the scattered logs and imagine him saying, "All right, let's see what Old Faithful can do today," to a saw whose teeth were half worn down. You can't help but smile. Joke number 1. If your household appliances had names, at least you'd know who to blame when things stop working. As you walk, the sun lifts higher, washing the landscape in pale gold. You notice details you missed before: the faint prints of a deer, a patch of crushed grass where some creature slept, a line of stones he might have laid out to guide his winter path. Every bit of this land became part of his routine. Every tree had a purpose. Every corner of the cabin had a job. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was clutter. You imagine the midday rhythm: sharpening tools, tightening lashings, checking food stores. His movements would have been deliberate, economical, almost meditative. Wilderness living has a funny way of teaching efficiency. Every wasted motion costs energy, and every saved calorie counts. A mainstream fact: many frontier journals describe how settlers instinctively reduced unnecessary gestures, no fidgeting, no excessive pacing, no dramatic arm movements. The wilderness trims your behavior like a strict editor. You pause near a fallen tree and step over it, letting one hand brush the damp bark. The forest around you feels like a memory palace of his long-ago footsteps. You picture him stopping here to rest, leaning against the trunk, wiping sweat from his brow, maybe muttering something about how the trees never stop growing no matter how many he chops. You exhale a small laugh. Joke number 2. If trees could send you a bill for labor, Alaska would be financially terrifying. Then you picture the quieter parts of the routine, the moments between tasks. Maybe he'd sit on the cabin step at dusk, watching the sky turn from blue to lavender to deep velvet. Maybe he'd track the moon to predict tides for fishing. Maybe he'd listen to the slow tick of the cooling stove, the cracking of the logs in the walls as they settled, the occasional chirp of a distant bird settling in for the night. A fringe debate among scholars and psychologists centers around whether routine in isolation becomes a form of meditation or imprisonment. Some argue structure becomes a sanctuary, a way to anchor the mind. Others claim it becomes a cage of repeated days. Standing here, you understand both sides. The routine feels soothing, but heavy, predictable, but unforgiving. Every day is quiet, but every day is critical. You wander further, following where his feet once carved faint paths through brush. In this imagined routine, mid-afternoon might be for fishing, setting new traps, or splitting yet another stack of logs taller than your entire self-worth. Joke number 3. If he invented a drinking game based on splitting wood, he'd never get anything done and probably freeze to death. By the time evening settles in your mind's eye, The routine slows again. A small fire crackles in the stove. Dinner sizzles. Shadows thicken in the corners of the cabin. He might have written in his journal or carved a piece of wood into something useful, or maybe just something to pass the time. Out here, routine isn't glamorous. It's grounding. You stand in the center of the clearing, feeling the invisible pulse of that old rhythm beneath your feet. And slowly, it dawns on you. The routine wasn't about surviving each day. It was about stitching those days into years, and those years into a life. A quiet, deliberate, astonishing life. And now, with the rhythm humming around you, you're ready to see how he kept his body fed in a place that tries very hard to starve you. You step toward the lake again, and the cold glint of the water reminds you of something essential. Routine keeps you sane, but food keeps you alive. And out here, alive is not a casual state, it's a daily negotiation with a landscape that doesn't particularly care if you win. You're about to understand why finding, storing, and defending food became a full-time job for a man living alone in the Alaskan wilderness for 30 straight years. The air tastes sharper as you walk closer to the shoreline, clean, mineral, faintly metallic. You crouch by the water, imagining him kneeling right here at dawn, dipping a tin can into the lake for drinking water and watching for fish shadows slicing beneath the surface. One mainstream fact: freshwater fish like lake trout and grayling were staple foods for early Alaskan homesteaders, and they remain some of the most reliable protein sources in remote regions today. If you had a net, a line, or even the patience to sit still longer than your average TikTok attention span, the lake could feed you. You picture him casting a line, watching ripples spread across the still water. Hours of quiet, hours of waiting, hours of staring so hard at a fishing float that it probably haunted his dreams. But when a fish finally tugged, that tiny jolt of resistance in the line must have felt like a gift from the universe itself. You imagine him pulling one in, its scales flashing, the smell of cold water rising from its body. You can practically hear the soft thump of it landing in a wooden box. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some hermits in northern regions swear that talking softly to the water calms fish, making them more likely to bite. Whether it's superstition or just a way to stave off loneliness, who knows? Joke number 1. If sweet-talking a lake suddenly improved your fishing odds, every seafood restaurant in America would have a whispering section. You stand again, scanning the tree line. Fish weren't enough. Not even close. He had to hunt too, and you can feel the weight of that choice. Hunting wasn't a sport here. It was survival with a steep learning curve. Moose, caribou, small game, each one came with its own terrain, patterns, and dangers. You shiver, imagining the size of a full-grown moose up close. Joke number 2. It's basically a horse that decided gym day was every day. You walk toward a patch of flattened grass near the trees, where you imagine he once knelt to check simple snares made from wire or cord. Rabbits, hares, ptarmigan, small animals whose tracks you start noticing the moment you look closely. A tiny set of prints, a tuft of fur snagged on underbrush. Signs that food moved constantly through this land, but only if you knew how to read the landscape like a book written with snow and shadows. Historians still argue whether his skill came naturally, or if wilderness living slowly sharpened instincts he never knew he had. Some say humans are hardwired for tracking, that it's an ancient part of our cognition waiting to be awakened. Others claim skill comes solely from repetition. Standing here, you suspect it's both. Your eyes are already catching patterns you would have missed an hour ago. You wander deeper into the forest, where the air smells faintly of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. You see where he might have stored food in the warmer months, hung high between trees, wrapped in cloth, or tucked into cold water caches along the lake. Mainstream fact: by suspending food away from the cabin and high off the ground, settlers reduced the chances of bears helping themselves to a midnight buffet. Speaking of bears, you notice claw marks on a nearby trunk, deep, wide, and far higher than your head. You swallow hard. Suddenly, your heartbeat sounds loud again. Joke number 3. Okay, you whisper to the claw marks, you win the height competition. You step away from the tree, imagining food storage becoming both science and art for him. He had to preserve meat through smoking, drying, or carefully freezing it during winter. You picture long strips of fish or meat hanging above the fire inside his cabin, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and slow curing. That scent is one of those details frontier journals always mention: warm, comforting, a sign that life would continue for another day. A quirky fringe detail. Some long-term hermits used handmade smoking racks that doubled as insect deterrents, because the constant smoke kept mosquitoes away from their living spaces. Practical, ingenious, and a little bit genius. You follow the faint outline of where the smokehouse might have stood, just a few stones now, moss growing over them. You stand still, imagining the daily ritual, checking the fire, adjusting the airflow, turning the strips of meat just enough to dry evenly. If one batch failed, it wasn't disappointing, it was dangerous. Food spoilage out here wasn't a bad meal. It was risking winter shortages. And winter was the real boss. You picture him packing food into sealed containers, burying some under snow, or stacking supplies in the cabin's coldest corner. You can almost feel him calculating. How many fish? How much dried meat? How many weeks left before thaw? How many calories does one person burn chopping wood in sub-freezing temperatures? They weren't abstract numbers, they were daily concerns. Historians still debate whether he ever came close to starvation, but the journals he kept hinted at tight margins in a few brutal seasons. And there's something humbling about that, this tightrope walk between comfort and scarcity. You walk through the clearing again, scanning the ground as if expecting to find a cache of preserved food still buried beneath the moss. Of course, there's nothing left now. The forest eats everything eventually. You stop near a patch of blueberry bushes, their stems bare for the season, but still familiar. Berries in summer, edible roots in fall, the occasional patch of wild greens, all tiny supplements that added variety to the otherwise repetitive diet. Foraging wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. And a surprisingly joyful one, judging by the calm, almost affectionate way many homesteaders wrote about berry season. Picking berries in the Alaskan sun feels like discovering treasure that doesn't try to run away. You let the imagined smells swirl around you, smoke, fish, wet earth, cached meat, the sharp scent of spruce, and suddenly, food feels less like a checklist and more like the heartbeat of this place. Every meal he ate was earned with sweat, patience, weather watching, and a little luck. And as you stand here, you understand why feeding himself became not just survival, but ritual. Because out here, the wilderness doesn't feed you. You learn how to feed yourself. You wander back toward the fallen logs near the old cabin site, and as the shadows shift over the mossy ground, you realize something crucial. None of this worked without tools. Not fancy tools. Not cordless drills or 18-volt anything. Just the battered, stubborn, half-broken equipment he carried with him into the wild, and the tools he later carved, improvised, sharpened, or stitched together when the originals failed. Because they did fail. Constantly. Out here, metal rusts, wood swells, blades dull, and anything delicate dies quickly. Yet somehow, he kept a tiny workshop running in the middle of nowhere for 3 decades. You kneel next to one of the logs, placing your hand on its smooth, weather-worn surface. You imagine him kneeling here too. In the dim light of evening, lantern flickering, sharpening his only saw with the slow, rhythmic patience of someone who knows exactly how long that blade needs to survive. One mainstream fact: early homesteaders often sharpened their tools more than they used them. The frontier rule was simple. Sharp tools keep you alive, dull tools get you hurt. And in a place where the nearest doctor is a floatplane ride and a miracle away, avoiding injury becomes a lifestyle. You walk toward a rock outcrop and spot a flattish stone, perfect whetstone shape. You rub your thumb along it, imagining him hunched over, grinding the blade of his axe at dawn or dusk, listening for the clean whisper of metal against stone. That sound must have been one of the few steady noises in his life, a kind of wilderness heartbeat. You picture his toolkit: a handsaw with a handle worn smooth, an axe with a head that probably needed rehafting every few years, a draw knife, chisels, maybe a small plane. And this is where the fringe facts get fun. Many long-term hermits made their own handles from birch or spruce, carving them meticulously to fit their own grip. Some scholars argue this kind of tool personalization created a bond between the user and the tool, almost like the way modern people feel about their favorite keyboard or gaming mouse. But way more life or death. Joke number 1. If your laptop ever stopped working from exposure to severe weather, you'd just buy a new one, not carve it from a tree. You look around, noticing how many things in this environment could become tools if you were patient or desperate enough. Fallen branches could be carved into wedges, river stones could be shaped into primitive scrapers. Even animal bones could become needles or hooks. You pick up a slender stick and bend it slightly. Too brittle for a trap, but good enough to imagine the delicate work he must have done. Whittling by the fire with the kind of steady concentration modern life rarely requires. You move back toward the remains of the cabin foundation and envision his improvised gear. A pot blackened from years of soot. A cooking grate made from scavenged metal. Possibly pieces of an old oil drum. A fishing rod fashioned from a flexible spruce tip, tied with hand-plaited line. Historians still argue whether he intentionally avoided more modern equipment or simply preferred the challenge of self-reliance. But either way, his kit was impressively minimal. Then your gaze lands on the forest around you, and you get the feeling that everything here was both resource and threat. Trees provide logs, but storms knock them into your path. Water gives fish, but ice tries to swallow your tools whole. Even the soil complicates things loose in summer, frozen like concrete in winter. You imagine him muttering about it as he tried to drive a peg into the ground. Of course it's frozen solid. Why wouldn't it be? Joke number 2. Alaska's unofficial motto might as well be, good luck with that. You shift your weight and notice a thin, bright thread of light reflecting off something metallic near the tree roots. You kneel and brush aside the moss. It's not a tool, just a rust-stained nail fragment, impossibly old. But it sparks an image. Him sitting by the fireplace, carefully straightening bent nails on an anvil stone because every single one mattered. Mainstream fact. Frontier settlers reused nails obsessively, sometimes pulling them from old structures or trading for them because transporting metal into remote regions was expensive and difficult. You tuck the fragment back under the moss, leaving it to its slow reunion with the earth. Then you imagine the repairs. Endless repairs. His boots wearing thin every few years until he patched them with scraps of leather from old gear. A torn coat fixed with sinew thread. Snowshoes relashed with rawhide strips that had to be soaked, twisted, and dried over several days. Historians still debate whether he followed indigenous Athabascan methods for snowshoe weaving or invented his own hybrid design, but either way, maintaining them was non-negotiable. Without snowshoes, winter travel becomes a sinking nightmare. A quirky fringe tidbit comes to mind. Some hermits kept a graveyard box of broken tool parts not to discard them, but to resurrect them later when inspiration struck. A bent blade could become a scraper. A cracked saw frame could become a brace. A frayed rope could become trap cord. You wonder whether he kept such a box, tucked into a corner like a museum of stubborn survival. You move toward the lake again, picturing his winter gear, ice chisel, hand auger, sled, maybe a homemade, toboggan pulled by sheer grit. The wind picks up slightly, brushing cold air across your cheeks, and suddenly you feel how vital every tool would have been. Losing even one could throw off weeks of planning, but the most important tool, oddly enough, was time. Wilderness homesteaders treated time like a currency. Sharpen now, cut later, mend tonight, haul tomorrow. And here's the part historians still argue about. Did the solitude slow his sense of time or make him hyper-aware of every single hour? Some journals suggest that people living alone become more attuned to microrhythms, sun angle, bird patterns, temperature shifts, using nature as their clock. You look up at the sky, noticing the subtle change in light. You're starting to feel it too. You take a few steps toward the clearing's edge, letting one hand trail across a rough log. The grain beneath your fingers feels like the memory of work, hundreds of strokes from a blade that shouldn't have lasted, but did. Not because it was strong, but because he was patient. You pause, taking one last look at the imagined tools scattered around your mind. The axe, the saw, the knife, the scraped bone needles, the handmade fishing gear, the rope twisted by hand. None of them would pass a modern product review. But all of them kept him alive. You straighten up, ready to follow the thread of his life into the biggest force that shaped it. The seasons. Seasons that didn't just change the scenery, seasons that decided everything. You stand at the clearing's edge and feel it, the shift in the air, the almost imperceptible change in temperature, the subtle shift in light that hints at a greater truth. Out here, the seasons don't politely rotate like pages on a calendar. They rule, and they rule with a confidence that doesn't care about your comfort, mood, or long-term plans. The wilderness is the landlord. You're just renting space, and your lease renews daily if the seasons allow it. You step forward, letting the wind sweep across your face. There's a hint of cold, even though the sun is out, a reminder that Alaska often runs on its own thermostat. One mainstream fact. Interior Alaska has some of the most extreme seasonal temperature swings in the world, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit between summer highs and winter lows. That shift alone explains why his life here wasn't divided by months, but by survival phases. You take a slow walk along the shoreline, feeling the ground beneath your boots change, texture from soft moss to grit. The lake is calm now, a mirror of pale sky, but you know that in winter it transforms into a frozen expanse, so thick you could build a house on it. In summer, it becomes a resource. In fall, a warning. In spring, a dangerous hybrid of slush and hidden water that can swallow you whole. Historians still argue which season posed the greatest threat to long-term wilderness dwellers, but he would have known the truth. All of them. You pause, crouching to trail your hand along the water. The surface is cool, almost chilled. Summer here never fully shakes the cold. It just negotiates with it. But the warmth it does provide is frantic, almost panicked, because the land is racing against the clock. Plants surge, animals feed constantly, and every living thing acts like the sunlight is on a countdown. Joke number 1. It's the biological equivalent of cramming for an exam you forgot about all year. You rise and glance toward the tree line. There, the spruces stand dark and tall, patiently waiting for winter's return. But in summer they hum with life, bees drifting lazily, birds flicking between branches, squirrels performing acrobatic stunts they absolutely did not rehearse. You take a few steps deeper into the forest and feel how different the energy is. The breeze is warmer, the smells richer, sap, earth, berries, the faint hint of sun-warmed pine. Summer gives you permission to move, build, fish, repair, explore. But it's short, brutally short. He'd have felt it in his bones. Every day counted. Every hour mattered. Even the sunlight was hyperactive, stretching late into the night during midsummer until darkness became a rare luxury. You imagine him trying to sleep with the cabin glowing faintly in the near-constant twilight, his mind wired by daylight that refused to quit. Then you picture the transition fall. The season historians actually talk about the least, but wilderness residents talk about the most, because fall is when you pay for any summer laziness. The mornings turn thin and cool. Frost fingers the edges of leaves. Berries vanish. Animals migrate. The wind starts practicing for its winter performance. It's the season that whispers, if you're not ready now, you won't be ready later. You spot a patch of fireweed, tall and magenta. A plant so common in Alaska, it's practically the floral calendar. Fringe tidbit. Locals say when fireweed reaches the top of its stalk, summer is over. You look at the nearest plant and imagine him checking it daily, noting the progress, mentally tallying his supplies, wood cut, meat dried, tools fixed, boots patched. Everything becomes math when winter is approaching. You walk deeper into the clearing, and that's when the real presence of winter hits you. Not physically, but in your imagination. You feel the weight of it, the fear, the awe. Winter wasn't just a season in his life. It was the central antagonist. It froze tools, sealed lakes beneath 5 feet of ice, stole daylight, and punished mistakes with immediate consequences. You imagine yourself waking on a winter morning, if morning even applies when the sun rises at near lunchtime. You open the cabin door, and the cold slaps you with the indifference of a tax collector. The air is sharp, tasting almost metallic. Every breath becomes visible. The snow squeaks under your boots, the famous negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit squeak, a sound so crisp it feels like stepping on glass powder. Your eyelashes collect frost. Your beard, if you had one, turns white at the tips. Joke number 2. Congratulations, you always wanted that distinguished wise hermit look. You picture him trudging through deep snow, pulling a sled laden with firewood, each step a small battle, and he'd have to do it daily. Wilderness journals often describe how winter travel becomes a kind of endurance meditation. Every footstep deliberate, every breath controlled, every sound amplified. Historians still argue whether isolation or cold pose the bigger threat in winter. But ask anyone who's lived through interior Alaska's coldest nights, and the answer becomes obvious. Then there's spring. Not the cute flowers blooming spring you see in movies. Alaska's spring is a noisy, messy, chaotic uprising of melting ice, cracking lake surfaces, knee-deep mud, and rivers roaring with meltwater. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time. You imagine him stepping outside to a world dripping, groaning, shifting like the entire landscape is waking up cranky from hibernation. Fringe tidbit. The sound of lake ice breaking in spring can be so loud it rattles windows. It's a deep, cannon-like boom that echoes across valleys. You probably wouldn't sleep through it. You look up at the sky, watching the light leak through the branches. The wilderness seasons aren't about scenery, they're about rules. They tell you when to gather, when to hunt, when to rest, when to panic. Living here for 30 years meant surrendering to those rules, accepting that nature is the timekeeper. Joke number 3 slips out as you glance around. Honestly, Google Calendar could never handle this. You step back toward the lake, feeling how each season layers over the land like memories, warmth over cold, growth over dormancy, silence over sound. And you realize something else. The seasons didn't just shape his life. They defined it. They set the rhythm of his days, the tone of his thoughts, the pace of his heartbeat. And now, it's time to face the harshest rhythm of all. Winter, when the wilderness stops playing nice, and survival becomes the only story. You take a slow breath as the imagined weight of winter settles on your shoulders, and suddenly, the air around you feels colder, even though you know it's just your mind playing along. But that's the thing about the Alaskan winter. Even the idea of it carries gravity. Out here, winter isn't a season, it's a test. A long, white jail sentence where the bars are snowdrifts, and the warden is the wind, and you obey the rules or you pay the price. You turn from the lake and feel your boots crunch through phantom snow as you picture the world transformed. The trees are stiff and heavy, their branches sagging under thick layers of frost. The lake is sealed under ice so dense it looks like marble. Every color is muted, every movement is slower, every sound is sharper. You imagine stepping outside his cabin at dawn, though dawn is generous, considering the sun barely shows up during the darkest months. The air hits you instantly, cold enough to sting inside your nose, cold enough to make your breath crackle, cold enough to make your eyelashes freeze into tiny white combs. Mainstream fact: interior Alaska can reach winter temperatures of 40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, with record stretches where the thermometer doesn't climb above 20 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks. It's a cold that doesn't negotiate, a cold that tests the structural integrity of your cabin, your gear, and your sanity. You imagine him pushing open the cabin door, the wooden latch stiff with frost. The world outside is so quiet it feels hollow, like sound has been erased. You take one careful step then, another, feeling the snow compress beneath you with that famous dry squeak that only happens at brutally low temperatures. It's like stepping on styrofoam that's judging you. You walk toward the tree line, imagining the hardest part of winter: movement. Every step through snow deeper than your knees feels like climbing a staircase made of powdered ice. Snowshoes help if you've maintained them, and you picture him strapped into his handmade pair, rawhide binding stiff, the wooden frames creaking as he trudged across drifts. Historians still argue whether long-term isolation sharpens muscle memory or dulls it, but regardless, winter demanded a strength that wasn't optional. A quirky fringe tidbit: some wilderness residents claim they can smell when temperatures drop below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, a faint metallic tang in the air, like cold burns the scent right out of the landscape. You wrinkle your nose, half thinking you can sense it too. Joke number 1. Great. Even the air has an attitude. You reach the shade beneath a group of spruce trees, and imagine the other constant companion of winter darkness, days where sunlight is more rumor than reality. You picture the sky stuck in permanent twilight, a dim blue glow from 10 in the morning to maybe 3 in the afternoon. Cabin life becomes a dance with shadows, tending the stove, melting snow for water, checking traps as quickly as possible, all while the world beyond the cabin walls feels like a cold, blue dream. Inside the cabin, the fire becomes the center of everything. You imagine the crackling logs, the iron stove radiating its slow, comforting heat, and you imagine him crouching beside it, feeding it piece by piece because letting the fire die wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Mainstream fact: wood consumption in Alaskan winters is enormous. Some homesteaders burn multiple cords a season. That means splitting, hauling, stacking, and drying wood becomes a year-round obsession. You run your hand along a log on the ground, imagining it neatly stacked next to his cabin. Wood isn't just fuel, it's security. It's survival. It's the difference between a long night and a long mistake. Winter also meant limited food mobility. Hunting was possible, but hard. Tracking animals in deep snow took skill and luck. You imagine him spotting the faint prints of a hare or the heavy depressions left by a moose. But often, winter food came from what he had prepared. Dried fish, smoked meat, cached supplies. You picture him rationing carefully, counting what remained, hoping the cold didn't stretch too far into spring. Historians still argue whether solitude becomes heavier in winter or simply more noticeable. But standing here, imagining the world wrapped in white silence, you feel it, the loneliness pressing like snow on a cabin roof. Months with no human voice, no trails to follow, no guarantees the supply you stored would last. You picture him sitting on his bunk at night, listening to the wind rattle the cabin walls. Sometimes it would howl, other times it would roar like a living creature stomping through the trees. Fringe tidbit. Winter winds in the Alaskan interior can reach speeds that make snow drift horizontally, piling into sculpted waves that can bury paths overnight. He would have woken to those drifts, opening his door to find the world reshaped while he slept. You pull your coat tighter around you even though you're warm and take a slow step through the imagined deep snow. Everything feels slower now. Your breath, your thoughts, even your heartbeat. Winter doesn't just change the land, it changes you. Joke number 2 slips out under your breath. Honestly, my bones are shivering just thinking about it. You picture him moving back toward the cabin at day's end, fingers stiff, boots packed with frozen snow, beard rimed with frost. Stepping into the dim warmth must have felt like stepping into a different universe. Light from a tiny lantern, the soft hiss of melting snow in a pot, the gentle crackle of the stove, small comforts, but enormous ones, when the outside world is trying to freeze everything in sight. Inside, he'd thaw slowly, peel off layers stiff with frost, hang damp clothes near the fire, and eat a simple meal. Then, with the wind roaring outside like something ancient and angry, he'd climb into bed and listen to the cabin creak, a reminder that even wood contracts in bitter cold. Historians still debate how he kept his spirits steady in such long winters. Some say routine did it, others claim solitude becomes its own companion after enough years. Whatever the truth, he endured. Year after year, winter after winter. You take one last look across the imagined frozen lake. Winter was the hardest season. But summer, the one joyful reprieve, came with its own frantic demands. And now you're ready to understand why summer felt less like a vacation and more like a race against time. Joke number 3 as you turn back toward the tree line. If surviving winter was level 10 difficulty, summer was the speed run. You blink away the imagined snowflakes still clinging to your mind, and slowly, almost like someone turned a dial, the world brightens again. Winter's suffocating silence loosens its grip, the shadows lift, the air loses its metallic bite, and suddenly you can feel the energy of a new season coursing through the land. It isn't gentle, it isn't slow. Summer in the Alaskan wilderness bursts in like a house guest who kicks the door open, drops all their bags at once, and starts rearranging furniture before you can say hello. You step toward the lake, and the world around you feels alive in a way winter never allowed. The water glints with warmer light, its surface rippling with a breeze that no longer feels hostile. You can smell the difference too: sap, warm soil, the faint sweetness of berries just beginning to ripen. The sunlight, while still cool compared to most places on Earth, feels honeyed and generous. One mainstream fact: interior Alaska can have shockingly warm summers, with long stretches of daylight and temperatures that reach into the 70 seconds or even 80 seconds. The trick is that summer doesn't last. It appears suddenly, thrashes everything into fast-forward growth, and then vanishes before you've fully caught your breath. And that's why, for him, summer wasn't rest. Summer was work. Summer was panic. Summer was sprinting while the clock ticked loud and fast. You walk along the shoreline, imagining his mornings during the warm months. The sun rising far earlier than your brain thinks is polite, maybe 3 a.m., maybe earlier. The light streams through the cabin, nudging him, awake whether he wants it or not. Even with curtains made of cloth or hide, the brightness is relentless, almost eager. And once the light enters your room, your body agrees, it's time to start. Breakfast is quick, maybe a chunk of dried fish, maybe something fried in a small pan. And then the day begins in earnest. You watch the lake, imagining him heading out in his handmade canoe or small boat, checking the nets, pulling in fish, gutting, and cleaning them right there on the rocky shore. Joke number 1. At this point, he probably knew more about fish anatomy than most biology majors. You shake your head, smiling slightly, and follow the path toward the tree line. Summer is lush here, unapologetically green, buzzing with insects, crowded with wildlife. Everything is awake. Everything is moving. And because everything is moving, he had to move too. Fishing wasn't enough. He needed to gather berries, repair winter damage, stockpile fresh wood, and check every inch of the cabin for leaks or weakness. Because summer is the season that gives you the resources to survive the other seasons. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some Alaskan hermits noted that the sheer number of mosquitoes in summer could nearly drive a person mad. Clouds of them, swarms, a moving fog of tiny vampiric nuisances. You swipe near your face instinctively, even though nothing is there, just from imagining his daily struggle. Joke number 2. Mosquito nets weren't just helpful, they were emotional support. You walk deeper into the trees, taking in the hum of imaginary insects and the warm, resinous smell rising from sun-baked spruce. Here, summer is a frenzy. Spruce tips burst with new growth, great for tea. Berry bushes droop under their own weight. The ground, no longer frozen solid, demands digging, hauling, fixing, building. You imagine him working through tasks in a kind of meditative rush. Tighten the roof shingles, reset the smokehouse frame, check trap lines, rebuild anything winter, snapped in half, chop wood until his arms felt like jelly. Historians still argue whether summer productivity in frontier communities came from necessity or from the biological high caused by near-constant daylight. You felt it yourself. Long daylight hours make you restless, energized, almost overclocked. And out here, you couldn't waste a single spark of that energy. You reach a spot where sunlight filters through the branches, landing on a patch of blueberry bushes. They're sparse now, but in real summer they'd be bursting. You crouch and imagine him collecting a tin cup's worth at a time, staining his fingers purple as he harvested enough berries to last through fall. Maybe he dried some on racks. Maybe he ate them fresh as a rare treat. Maybe he mashed them into a kind of wilderness jam, thick and tangy. Food variety is a luxury out here, and summer's offerings mattered. You stand again, brushing imaginary berry juice from your fingers, and wander toward a fallen log. You picture him sitting here during a rare break, sweating lightly in the mild heat, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, watching the horizon shimmer. And somewhere in that quiet moment he'd hear it. The buzz of bees, the call of birds, the whisper of leaves rustling. Sounds that vanished entirely in winter. Sounds that reminded him the world wasn't always hostile. But the summer warmth wasn't just pleasant. It was deceptive, because beneath its comfort was a countdown. Fireweed blooms rising slowly up their stalks. Migrating birds beginning their restless pace. The sun dipping a little earlier each night. Nature's subtle reminders. Prepare. And prepare he did. You imagine him curing fish in the smokehouse, slicing fillets into long ribbons, hanging them carefully, adjusting the fire so the smoke stayed gentle and constant. The smell would cling to everything, clothes, cabin walls, even skin, but it meant food security. You picture racks full of drying meat, outside, guarded against scavengers. And speaking of scavengers, bears were active in summer, stronger, hungrier, bolder. Historians still debate whether he had close calls with them, but the few notations he recorded hint he had a healthy respect for their presence. You walk back toward the lake's edge, letting a warm breeze graze your cheeks. The water looks inviting now, shimmering with lazy ripples. You imagine him paddling across it, collecting driftwood or checking deeper fishing spots. Maybe he even allowed himself to relax for a moment. But not long. Summer wasn't generous with time. Joke number 3 slips out as you admire the sunlight. Great weather for a picnic if your picnic guests weren't giant carnivores. You chuckle softly, but there's truth under the humor. In the wilderness, beauty and danger always share a border. You take a deep breath, letting the imagined warmth fill your lungs. Summer in Alaska is a season of urgency, beauty, and frantic work. It's a wild, bright, fever dream. A rush to fill the pantry, repair what winter broke, and prepare for the cold that will inevitably return. And in the middle of it all, he wasn't alone. Not exactly, because out here, the wilderness is full of company, some very curious company. Which brings you to the next chapter of his life out here. The unexpected guests that wander into your solitude, sometimes uninvited, sometimes unforgettable. You take a few steps toward the tree line again, listening to the imaginary drone of a summer insect somewhere above your shoulder. And then you hear it, a soft rustle, a distant crack of underbrush, the faint shuffle of something moving just beyond your line of sight. You stop mid-step, your breath held, your ears straining. Because out here, solitude doesn't mean being alone. It means being outnumbered. The Alaskan wilderness is the kind of place where your neighbors don't need fences. They don't need introductions either. They simply appear fur, feathers, claws, hooves, wings wandering through your existence like they own the place. And, to be fair, they kind of do. You step slowly toward the sound, letting branches part around you. A squirrel darts up a tree, chattering with the kind of energy that feels personal, like it's berating you for stepping on its patch of moss. Joke number 1. If squirrels could leave bad Yelp reviews, you would 100% have one. You breathe. Out, relief mixing with amusement, but the forest has more surprises. A few yards away you spot the faint imprint of massive hooves in the soft soil. Moose tracks fresh ones. The prints sink deep, wide apart, telling you this wasn't a baby moose. This was a full-grown, CrossFit-level moose. The kind that looks like it could bench press a car and then complain the car wasn't heavy enough. One mainstream fact: moose injure more Alaskans each year than bears. Not because they're aggressive by nature, but because they're enormous, unpredictable, and surprisingly fast. You kneel beside the track, imagining him doing the same. Moose wandered into his solitude often, snorting softly, chewing willow branches, staring blankly at the cabin, like they were judging his carpentry. You can picture it so clearly, him peeking through the window at a pair of giant antlers, blocking his front yard, like the world's most intimidating lawn ornament. You stand again and drift deeper into the Kroof forest. The air grows cooler, quieter, thicker. A raven swoops overhead, maybe the same one that's been following your journey since earlier, because ravens out here are known for their long memories and, for lack of a better word, their nosiness. Fringe tidbit. Some indigenous stories describe ravens as tricksters who follow travelers to see what mischief might unfold. Whether or not that's true, the way this bird circles above you feels a little too convenient. You whisper, "I see you," and the raven caws back as if saying, "Good." Animals were his companions long before he saw another human face. Some were harmless, some not so much. You wander toward the lake again, imagining an evening where he sat by the shore, sharpening a tool or cleaning fish. Then a heavy rustle behind him, a dark shape moving between the trees. The moment freezes, the air slows, and he turns to see a brown bear lumbering out onto the beach. Not attacking, not threatening, just existing, maybe 50 yards away. Close enough to make your survival instincts do a backflip. You swallow hard and glance at the tree line. Bears weren't daily visitors, but they were common enough that he had to develop an entire strategy around them. Storing food high, burning scraps, cooking away from the cabin sometimes, keeping his scent spread carefully so animals knew he was nearby. Historians still argue whether long-term hermits develop a sixth sense for detecting large wildlife. But the journals from people living alone in the north suggest that yes, eventually, you feel when you're being watched. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some hermits claim they could tell the personality of local bears over time, identifying individuals by size, fur markings, or even behavior. You imagine him naming one, Old Cinnamonback, or the Slow Walker. Names give shape to fear. And familiarity, strangely, makes the wilderness feel less hostile. You move past the shoreline and slip into a narrow animal trail. The brush is disturbed, just enough to show regular use. Maybe by wolves, maybe by foxes, maybe by both. You pause. A wolf pack never approached his cabin aggressively, at least, not according to anything he recorded. But they were there, always on the periphery, ghosts moving through the trees. If you listened closely at night over the crackle of the stove, you might hear a distant howl stretching across the frozen lake. A sound that can be haunting, yes, but also astonishingly comforting in its wild honesty. Tonight, you imagine yourself hearing it. A long, rising note. Then another. Higher. Then a chorus. The forest doesn't feel empty in those moments. It feels alive and ancient. Your breath hitches slightly as you turn around, half expecting glowing eyes. Joke number 2. If any wolf shows up expecting snacks, I'm absolutely telling them you invited them. You walk farther, the forest shifting into a brighter patch where sunlight spills through thin canopy. Here you imagine gentler visitors, red foxes trotting along with feather-light steps, tilting their heads with uncanny curiosity. Snowshoe hares darting across the ground like airborne cotton balls. Ptarmigan rustling in bushes, pretending they're subtle despite being about as graceful as bowling pins on legs. Animals were entertainment, challenge, and companionship. He watched them. They watched him. Some got close, too close. Like the time, you imagine, a porcupine decided his cabin porch looked like a chewable salt lick. Frontier journals mention porcupines gnawing on wood structures because they're attracted to the minerals in human sweat. You look at the logs around you and think, yeah, that tracks. Joke number 3. Nothing says good morning like finding a porcupine nibbling your house. You stop beneath a tall spruce, listening to the distant splash of a fish. Even now, standing in imagination, you feel the rhythms of countless wild creatures brushing around your awareness. And you understand why living alone never truly meant alone. The animals became markers of time: moose in early summer, foxes bold in fall, ravens watching year-round. Their patterns became part of his routine, their presence part of his mental landscape. In a strange way, they stitched his solitude together. You breathe deeply, letting the thoughts settle. Solitude in the wilderness is shared with countless unseen lives moving just outside your field of vision. And now, with the animals lingering in your mind, it's time to step into the most hidden part of long-term isolation. Not the silence, not the cold, not the predators, but the mind itself, what happens to it when years pass without human company. You stand beneath the spruce tree, letting the imagined rustle of wildlife fade until the forest sinks back into that familiar hush. Except now, after weeks, months, years alone, the quiet doesn't stay quiet. It starts to echo. It starts to bend. It starts to talk back, not with voices, but with the parts of your mind you don't normally hear, because modern life is loud enough to drown them out. You take a step forward, and the forest seems to inhale with you. Another step, and something shifts not outside, but inside. You've spent hours now imagining his routines, his seasons, his encounters with animals. But none of those truly prepared you for the part of solitude that doesn't get recorded in journals, the part no one sees, the slow transformation of your inner world. You reach a fallen log, sit, and let the stillness embrace you. This is the moment when loneliness stops being a condition and becomes a companion, a subtle one, a persistent one, and, strangely, not always an unpleasant one. One mainstream fact: long-term isolation studies, yes. Actual scientific studies show that humans begin developing stronger internal narratives when deprived of regular social contact. Your mind becomes your bees in gesters, primary conversation partner. Not in a dramatic or alarming way, just more active, more vivid. Your thoughts grow louder, your memories sharper, your self-reflection deeper. And sitting here, you start to feel it too. You rub your hands together, listening to the faint rasp of skin on skin. It sounds almost exaggerated. You whisper to yourself just to test the acoustics, and the sound lands like a pebble dropped in a still pond. You understand now why he kept journals, why he talked to animals, why he narrated his days quietly under his breath. When you spend years without another human voice, your own voice becomes a tool, not for speaking, but for keeping time, keeping rhythm, keeping you in the center of your world. You walk a few steps deeper into the trees, and the quiet wraps around you like thick cloth. Out here, solitude exposes everything. It strips away every distraction you didn't realize was distraction. It turns the volume up on your inner life until even the smallest thought glows like an ember. Historians still argue whether solitude sharpens the mind or softens it, whether it makes a person wiser or simply more inward. Some say isolation creates clarity. Others say it creates distortion. But the truth, the lived truth, is probably somewhere in the middle. You pause to examine a patch of moss, brushing it with your fingertips. The texture is soft, almost plush. You imagine him crouching here on a similar day, examining the ground for animal tracks while simultaneously thinking about something completely unrelated, maybe a memory from childhood, maybe a question he had no one to ask, maybe a thought that grew into a full monologue because there was no one to interrupt it. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some long-term wilderness hermits reported developing mind loops. Little internal stories they told themselves repeatedly, not because they were losing touch, but because storytelling gave structure to the endless quiet. You feel that potential, now your imagination, gently filling the gaps between sounds. You lean against a spruce trunk, feeling its rough bark press into your back. You inhale deeply. You exhale slowly. The air tastes clean enough to sting. And then you realize something subtle but important. Solitude is not the same as being alone. Out here, solitude is a job, a practice, something you learn to navigate. Some days it feels peaceful. Other days it feels heavy, like a cold stone sitting in your chest. You imagine him pacing the cabin on a dark winter night, trying to decide which feeling today belonged to. Maybe he recited memories just to keep them sharp. Maybe he talked to the fire when it crackled too loudly. Maybe he greeted the sunrise with a whispered, "Hello," just to hear a voice. You smile softly at the thought, not mocking, but understanding. Joke number 1 as you glance around. Honestly, if a pinecone said hello back, I'd probably just roll with it. You step forward again, and a breeze brushes through the treetops, a soft, thrumming sound that feels almost like an answer. Maybe that's why solitude didn't break him. Maybe the forest spoke in ways that weren't words, but still soothed something inside. You crouch beside a stump and run your hand across its rings. Dozens of them, years upon years. And you imagine your own years passing like that. One ring for each season survived, each winter endured, each summer raced through, each moment of loneliness weathered just like the storms outside. You stand again and follow a narrow path that winds back toward the lake. The water glimmers through gaps in the trees. The world is bright, but the quiet beneath that brightness feels deeper now, more layered, more complex. Solitude sharpens your senses, yes, but it also sharpens your mind in strange ways. You notice small details more clearly. You remember things more vividly. You replay old conversations from years ago and analyze them with newfound clarity. Joke number 2. At this rate, you could win arguments you lost in 2014. You step onto the shoreline, feeling stones shift beneath your boots. The breeze off the lake is cool, clean, almost musical as it ripples the surface. And you think about the nights he sat here, listening to waves lap against the rocks, letting the soft rhythm calm his thoughts. In the absence of people, nature becomes the choir that sings you to sleep. Historians still debate whether solitude creates wisdom or simply stretches time until it feels profound. But you don't need a debate. You can feel it yourself. Solitude makes you notice things. It makes you reconsider everything. It makes you question and sometimes answer your own life. You walk a few feet along the waterline, watching the sunlight glitter. And you understand, in this quiet moment, that solitude for him wasn't boredom or punishment. It was a lens, a kind of clarity that modern life rarely allows. Joke number 3 slips out easily. Honestly, a week out here, and I'd probably give TED Talks to my frying pan. You smile, because humor helps. It keeps you grounded. It keeps the solitude from swelling too big. You take one last look across the still water, breathing in the quiet. The deeper solitude gets, the more you need something to anchor your thoughts. And that's exactly what he did. He wrote, he recorded, he documented every day, not to entertain anyone else, but to keep himself tethered to the passing of time. And now it's time for you to see how he preserved a life no one else witnessed. You follow the curve of the shoreline until the trees open into a small clearing, a quiet, sun-warmed pocket of land that feels almost like a natural room. The moment you step into it, you sense something different in the air. A faint weight, a sense of lingering presence. Not supernatural, just human. The kind that comes from years of someone sitting here, thinking here, writing here, because this is where he recorded everything. You ease down onto a flat rock, warm from the sun, and imagine him sitting in this exact spot with a small notebook balanced on his knee, a simple pencil in his hand, no fancy pens, no leather-bound journals, no inspirational quotes embossed on the cover, just paper and graphite, the bare-bones tools of documenting a life most people would never see. One mainstream fact: wilderness homesteaders and explorers almost always kept journals. Not for posterity, not for fame, but because recording the passing of days created structure, accountability, and sanity. Writing became a substitute for conversation, a way to process the enormous quiet. And for him, writing was a lifeline. You look down at your own hands, imagining that pencil moving with steady strokes. He wrote about the weather, about the lake freezing earlier than usual, about a moose wandering too close, about repairing his stove, about feeling tired, hungry, content, lonely, proud. He didn't dramatize it, he documented it. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was trying to stay anchored. Historians still argue whether his journals were more practical record-keeping or emotional meditation. But sitting here, you suspect they were both. You imagine him writing late into the winter nights, the cabin dim except for the warm flicker of a lantern, his breath faintly visible in the cold air. The scratch of pencil on paper must have been the loudest sound in the room. You lift your fingers to your ear as if to catch that sound. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It's easy to imagine. You stand again, walking toward the center of the clearing. A faint depression in the ground catches your eye, a place where he might have stored supplies or sat regularly. You kneel beside it, brushing pine needles aside. The earth here feels undisturbed but somehow heavy with memory. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some long-term hermits developed a habit of writing multiple journal versions, one for daily events, one for long-term reflections, and one that acted almost like letters to an imagined reader. Not because anyone would read them, but because the act of shaping thoughts for a listener kept the mind sharp. You wonder if he ever wrote a page beginning with, "If someone ever finds this." You step back and wander toward the trees again, sunlight flickering across your face. You picture him recording the flight patterns of geese as they migrated overhead, noting the precise day fireweed reached the top of its stalk, describing the thickness of lake ice in February. His journals weren't just reflections, they were data, clues. A running reference manual that helped him anticipate the land's patterns. Mainstream fact. Many long-term wilderness dwellers use journals as survival tools, tracking animal movement, weather cycles, crop failures, snowfall patterns. Living alone meant your memory had to be accurate, and writing reinforced that accuracy. You stop beside a tall spruce and rest your palm against its trunk. The bark is rough, flaking slightly beneath your touch. You imagine him doing the same, pausing during a long day, leaning against a tree, scribbling quick notes in his book about where he found a new patch of berries or a promising fishing spot. You can almost see the pencil stub tucked behind his ear, worn down to half its original size. A breeze stirs the needles overhead, and you hear a faint, distant rustle. It reminds you of another sound he would have written about often. The groaning of ice shifting under the lake. That deep, resonant boom that made the winter landscape feel alive. He probably recorded the exact date each year when the first cracks appeared, a tradition as old as the frontier itself. As you walk back toward the rock where you started, you begin to understand the true purpose of his journals. They were a map, not of the land, but of himself, a record of his changing thoughts, shifting priorities, fears that grew, and fears that faded. He may not have spoken to another person for months, even years at times, but through writing, he still spoke. He still reflected. He still existed in language. Joke number 1 slips softly from your lips. Honestly, if my diary had this much discipline, it would file a complaint. You chuckle, but the sentiment stands. This was long-term documentation. 3 decades of entries. A lifetime of quiet words. You sit again, imagining flipping through those pages. Each day recorded in simple, factual strokes. Cut wood. Check traps. Saw wolf tracks. Cabin warm. Clouds coming in. Feel good today. Feel tired today. He recorded the ordinary because the ordinary mattered. Out here, a quiet day wasn't boring, it was a blessing. You look up at the sky as a raven sails overhead, its wings beating with lazy confidence. You imagine him writing about that too, maybe giving that raven a name. Maybe noting how often it visited. Journaling sharpens the senses. Writing makes you observe. And observation in the wilderness is survival. Joke number 2. If he ever ran out of pencil lead, he deserved an honorary PhD in endurance. You step toward the lake once more, the wind carrying a faint scent of cold water. You imagine him ending each night with the same ritual, closing the journal, setting the pencil aside, listening to the fire settle. A day documented, a mind anchored, a man alone, but not adrift. Historians still debate whether his journals were meant for anyone but himself. But reading them now, if you could, you'd probably hear the heartbeat behind every line. Not loud, not desperate, just steady. Steady in a way only solitude can produce. You close your eyes briefly, imagining the last word he wrote each night. A small mark on a page no one else saw. And yet, those words kept him steady through storms, injuries, hunger, cold, and the slow erosion of time. Joke number 3 slips out quietly. Honestly, his journal probably had a better attendance record than most office jobs. You smile, letting the imagined pages flutter through your mind. Then you open your eyes to the clearing once more. He wrote what he lived. He lived what he wrote. And tomorrow, inevitably, something would break, and he'd have to fix it, because the wilderness breaks everything. You rise from the sun-warmed rock, brushing pine needles from your palms, and step slowly back toward the tree line. The air shifts, again subtle, but unmistakable. A reminder that out here, nothing ever stays perfect for long. Tools dull, roof beams sag, traps snap, boots tear, animals chew what they shouldn't, weather yanks at anything not nailed down. Time erodes everything. And the wilderness, well, the wilderness is an equal opportunity destroyer. You walk toward a cluster of fallen logs, imagining the constant cycle of repair that ruled his days. Because if there was one truth he learned early on, it was this. Everything breaks. Everything. And fixing things wasn't a task, it was a lifestyle. You crouch beside a fractured log, tracing the sharp edge where the wood split. You picture him kneeling like this, brow furrowed, weighing whether he could salvage the piece or needed to start from scratch. One mainstream fact. Frontier homesteaders planned entire days around repairs because something always gave out: weatherproofing, hinges, fishing gear, storage containers, sled runners. His cabin wasn't a finished home, it was an ongoing experiment. You stand, gripping the edge of a leaning spruce for balance, as you step over a mound of moss. The spruce sways slightly, its bark rough and cold. Trees looked solid, but winter storms could snap them like pencils. And when one fell near the cabin, he had to clear it, cut it, haul it, and figure out whether any pieces were worth keeping. You imagine him muttering, "Of course it fell toward the cabin," because the wilderness loved dramatic irony. Joke number 1. Honestly, at this point Alaska needs to stop trying to renovate his house. You take a few steps toward the lake, where old stones mark what might have been the foundation of a shed or work area. You kneel, brushing moss aside. This is where repairs really lived, where tools got mended, boots got patched, and where he probably uttered a record number of quiet, frustrated sighs. You lift your head and imagine one of his toughest repair seasons, early spring. The freeze-thaw cycle turned everything into a malfunctioning puzzle. Wood swelled, metal contracted, hinges warped, lashings loosened. Historians still argue whether spring or fall created more structural problems for wilderness cabins. But most homesteaders agreed. Spring was chaos. Beautiful, soggy chaos. You picture him stepping outside after the first thaw, surveying his cabin like a mechanic checking a car after it's been parked under a tree for 2 years. The roof drips in uneven beats. A corner beam looks questionable. The chimney stones shifted, and the snow melting now reveals every mistake winter buried. You smile sympathetically. Everything nature breaks, he fixes, and everything he fixes, nature tests again. You wander toward the edge of the clearing, where a half-rotted log lies embedded in the soil. It reminds you of a more nerve-wracking category of repairs, the ones he had to perform before things failed catastrophically. The stovepipe, critical for warmth, might develop a hairline crack. The roof might sag suspiciously after a heavy snowfall. A trap might lose tension. A storage rack might begin to lean. Prevention wasn't optional. Prevention was survival. Mainstream fact. Many remote homesteaders conducted weekly rounds, inspecting structural points from roof to floor to foundation. You imagine him walking the perimeter of the cabin, tapping beams with a piece of birch, listening for that hollow warning thud. A soft, unsettling sound that meant, this beam's not long for this world. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some frontier residents swore they could hear when their cabins needed repairs. The subtle change in how wind moved through gaps, or how the floorboards flexed. You run your fingers along a tree trunk and wonder whether, after enough years, you'd start hearing those things too. You walk, farther into the trees, and your foot bumps something half buried beneath leaves. You kneel, brushing away dirt. A bent scrap of metal, maybe from an old hinge or a tool he reinvented. Its edges are rust-softened, crumbly. You set it back gently. Everything breaks. But he didn't throw things away, not if he could help it. Out here, trash didn't exist, only future projects. Rope ends became trap lines. Tin cans became scoops or candle molds. Worn clothing became patch material. Even broken snowshoe frames could be cannibalized for spare parts. You imagine him sitting by lamplight on a winter evening, sewing a torn boot with sinew thread and a needle made from bone or steel scavenged from a broken tool. His hands steady, his face calm. Fixing things wasn't an annoyance, it was a ritual. A tether. A reminder that he still had agency in a place that often felt uncontrollable. But not all repairs were calm. You take a step toward the lake again, letting the wind graze your cheek. You imagine him out on the frozen surface in late January, checking his fish hole and hearing a sharp crack beneath the ice. Your stomach flips. Repairs weren't limited to solid objects. He had to repair situations, fast. Fix plans, fix mistakes, fix miscalculations. Historians still debate the closest calls in his long solitude. Injuries, storms, gear failures. But his journals suggest at least one major incident involving a heavily damaged canoe after a sudden windstorm nearly dashed it against rocks. You picture him hauling the fractured boat ashore, kneeling beside it with cold fingers, calculating how many days it would take to repair the frame, how many trips for resin, how many strips of root or fabric to rebuild lashings. Joke number 2 as you glance at the lake. On the bright side, if the canoe breaks, you're only stranded forever. You let the humor dissolve into thought. The deeper truth settles in. In a place like this, resilience isn't dramatic. It's routine. You fix things because that's how you stay alive. You repair what's damaged. You reinforce what's weak. You adapt when something fails in your hands. You walk back into the clearing, the ground springy beneath your boots, and picture him at the end of each long day, hands sore, clothes smelling of sap and smoke, mind buzzing with a list of tomorrow's repairs. He wasn't building a monument. He was maintaining a life held together by willpower, wood shavings, and stubborn persistence. Joke number 3 slips quietly from your lips. Honestly, if anything around here lasted more than a year, it deserved a trophy. You smile softly, and now, with repairs patched into the rhythm of your thoughts, it's time to face the moments he couldn't fix with a tool or a patch. Moments when the wilderness lashed out in storms, fires, ice, and sudden danger. Moments that nearly ended his decades alone. You take a slow breath, feeling the imaginary weight of the repairs, still lingering on your hands, and then almost on cue, the air shifts again. A sudden hush falls over the clearing. Not the peaceful kind, not the contemplative kind. This hush feels tighter, heavier, the way a room feels right before a storm shakes the windows. And you realize something he learned early in his years of solitude. The wilderness doesn't wait for you to be ready. It strikes when it wants. You step into the open space, and a gust of wind rakes through the trees, hard, cold, and blunt. Even in your imagination, you feel the sting of it. You wrap your arms around yourself reflexively and glance at the sky. The clouds have changed. A long grey smear stretches across the horizon, thickening, lowering. In Alaska, weather doesn't approach politely. It descends. One mainstream fact. Interior Alaska experiences sudden, violent storm fronts that can appear out of nowhere, fueled by extreme temperature differences in the region. Winds can shift from calm to 60 miles per hour in minutes. Snow can fall thick as poured flour. Rain can drop temperatures by 20 degrees in an hour. And storms were only one kind of danger. You take a few steps toward the lake, imagining the first time he encountered a serious windstorm. Maybe it was in early autumn, when the lingering warmth tricked him into believing the day would stay mild. The sky darkened, the treetops roared, and before he could even secure the cabin shutters, the storm slammed into the valley like a freight train. You picture him bracing the cabin door as wind howled through the gaps between logs, shaking the walls with a force that felt deliberate. A loose branch clattered across the roof like a rolling boulder, then another, and another, each one landing with a heavy, heart-jolting thud. You glance up at the trees around you, suddenly aware of how tall they are, how precariously they lean, how many dead limbs hang like swords waiting to drop. Historians still argue whether he ever feared the big storms, or if after enough years he grew accustomed to them. But the journals he left behind describe at least a few nights when the wind sounded like the sky was tearing. You swallow, imagining that sound. Then, and this is when your stomach dips, you picture fire. Because in Alaska, fire is both ancient and inevitable. A quirky fringe tidbit. Lightning-caused wildfires in remote Alaska often go entirely unmonitored, burning for weeks or months through forests no one ever sees. Some even smolder underground in the peat layer, surviving winter and flaring back to life in spring. He would have known this. He would have smelled it. You imagine him waking one summer night to the faint scent of smoke drifting through the cabin window. Not the comforting smoke of his stove. Something harsher, wilder, the kind of smoke that prickles the back of your throat. He steps outside. The night is glowing faintly orange along the horizon. Not close, but close enough. Fire traveling through dry brush, jumping from treetop to treetop, throwing sparks like angry stars. You look at the trees surrounding you now, their branches thick, dry, resinous. A forest like this can turn into a torch faster than your instincts can process. You take a step back, feeling tension creep into your shoulders. He would have prepared for that. Clearing brush around the cabin, cutting fire breaks, storing water in barrels, keeping tools ready. But fire is unpredictable. Fire is hungry. Fire doesn't care that one man built a life out here. You imagine him watching the glow intensify before the wind shifted miraculously, pushing the flames away from the lake. A lucky break. A life saved not by planning, but by weather whim. Joke number 1 slips out softly. Honestly, Alaska's fires need a chill pill. You keep walking until you reach a patch of open ground where the earth dips subtly. A reminder of another danger. Meltwater floods. Spring in Alaska is chaos incarnate. Ice cracks like thunder. Rivers burst their banks. Snowmelt carves channels through forests, ripping roots from the ground. You imagine him waking one morning to the sound of rushing water louder than usual and stepping outside to see the lake swelling higher than normal. Water creeping toward his cabin foundation inch by inch, a wave of dread punching the air from his lungs. Mainstream fact: glacial melt and rapid thaw can cause flash floods that reshape entire landscapes. No warnings, no forecasts. Just a surge of water that doesn't care where your walls are. He might have spent frantic hours digging trenches to redirect the flow, piling stones, blocking channels, fighting water the way he fought winter with stubbornness and speed. And then there was ice. You walk to the lake's edge, staring at the calm surface. In winter, that calm becomes a frozen plain. Beautiful, but treacherous. You take a mental step onto imaginary ice, and it creaks beneath your boots, sharp, brittle, like thin glass. You wince. He learned early on that ice isn't uniform. Some parts freeze thick, some thin, some rot underneath where currents swirl. And crossing it always carried risk. One misstep, one hidden weak spot, and the lake could swallow you whole. Historians still debate whether he ever broke through, but entries hint at close calls he preferred not to elaborate on. You imagine him testing the ice with his chisel, every tap sending tremors through the cold silence, every crack a warning, a quirky fringe detail. Some northern dwellers say they can hear safe ice, the deep, resonant hum of thick sheets versus the hollow sound of dangerous slabs. You kneel, pressing your ear to the imaginary frozen surface, wondering if you could ever learn the difference. You stand again, turning slowly toward the tree line. And that's when you feel it the most unpredictable danger of all. Wind. Not the steady, aggressive wind from storms. This wind is subtle, unsettling. The kind that creeps through the trees and changes direction without warning. The kind that signals a shift, a sudden cold snap, an incoming blizzard, or simply the land reminding you that your plans don't matter here. You imagine him caught in a sudden whiteout, snow whipping sideways, visibility shrinking to nothing, landmarks erased, a trip to check traps turning into a desperate attempt to find his own cabin in a wall of swirling white. Frontier stories are full of such dangers, men dying feet from their homes because the snow swallowed the world whole. You wrap your arms tighter as you imagine that. Joke number 2, murmured to yourself. Note to self, snowstorms are not team players. You take a deep breath, feeling the imagined cold tighten your chest, and then let it out slowly. The wilderness is breathtaking, yes, but it's also brutal, violent, unpredictable, beautiful in ways that feel dangerous, dangerous in ways that feel beautiful. Storms, fire, ice, floods, sudden cold, snaps, falling trees, predators, injuries, equipment failures. These weren't rare events, they were realities, and he survived them all. You take one last look across the landscape, letting the intensity fade from your mind. Because the wilderness wasn't only danger, it was also reward. Moments so stunning, so quiet, so pure that they pulled him deeper into solitude instead of pushing him away. Moments of beauty that made all the hardship worth it. And now you're ready for those. Joke number 3 as you start walking. After all this, a peaceful moment better show up with snacks. You walk slowly, letting the tension of storms and ice loosen its grip on your imagination. The forest exhales with you, as if relieved that for a moment the threats have stepped aside. And now, emerging from that long parade of dangers, the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness rises around you with a softness that almost feels unreal. Because for him, these moments weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. You stop near the lake, and suddenly everything is brighter. The sky stretches in a perfect, endless blue. The water glimmers like burnished glass. A warm, honey-scented breeze lifts the tiny hairs on your arms. It's one of those days, the rare ones, that make you understand why someone would choose to live 30 years out here. You step closer to the water and crouch, dipping your hand into the cold surface. The ripples shimmer around your fingers, catching the sunlight in tiny, dancing stars. One mainstream fact: Alaska experiences some of the clearest freshwater bodies in North America, many filtered naturally through glacial systems. That clarity, literal and metaphorical, was part of the beauty he lived in. You imagine him sitting right here on an early summer morning, coffee tin warming on a small fire, breath lifting in faint wisps even though the sun is already blazing across the water. Maybe he watched loons glide across the lake, their sleek bodies slicing through reflections like moving ink. Maybe he listened to their distant calls, a sound so haunting it can make your chest ache, even if you don't know why. You straighten and walk along the shoreline, noticing the little things he must have cherished. The sparkle of mica in the stones, the thin green stems of new spruce tips, tiny white flowers peering from moss carpets like shy stars. You stop and smile at a cluster of fireweed swaying in the breeze. Vibrant magenta, impossibly delicate, reaching upward as if trying to paint the sky. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some long-term Alaskan residents call fireweed the wilderness calendar, because its blooming cycle mirrors the whole summer. That means each bright blossom wasn't just pretty, it was information. Hope disguised as color. You step into the forest, where the light shifts into soft beams. They angle through the spruce branches in long golden strokes, illuminating dust motes floating like tiny planets. The stillness here feels sacred. Quiet, yes, but not empty. This is the kind of beauty that makes your shoulders drop and your breathing slow, even if you didn't realize you were tense. You picture him pausing during a long day of gathering, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, then suddenly stopping, caught off guard by a moment like this. A shaft of light, a rustle of leaves, a sudden burst of birdsong. Moments that felt like gifts. Moments that convinced him, again and again, to stay. Historians still argue whether solitude heightens appreciation for nature or simply removes the distractions that normally dull it. But standing here, feeling your senses sharpen, you lean toward the latter. Without noise, without crowds, without schedules, beauty becomes louder. You step further into the trees, and a soft cracking sound draws your attention. You turn to see a snowshoe hare bounding into view, white in winter, but now mottled grey-brown as it transitions to summer coloring. It pauses mid-hop, twitching its nose at you with comical intensity. "Joke number one," whispered gently. "Relax, little buddy. I left my lunch at home." The hare blinks once, unimpressed, then vanishes with a flick of its oversized feet. You laugh quietly, the sound swallowed by moss and needles. You continue until you reach a fallen log draped in thick emerald moss, glowing faintly in the afternoon light. You sit, inhale deeply, and let your gaze drift across the forest floor. You imagine him sitting like this too, not working, not worrying, just witnessing, listening to the wind weave through branches, watching a single leaf twist as it falls, feeling the deep, ancient heartbeat of the land. Beauty wasn't occasional here. It was constant, but it was subtle too, requiring attention. You rise again and wander to a higher ridge, overlooking the lake. From here, the entire landscape opens up. Mountains loom in the distance, blue, jagged, timeless. Clouds cling gently to their peaks, like scarves of mist. The lake below glimmers like hammered silver, and the air feels pure in a way that almost startles you. You imagine him standing on this ridge at sunset, watching the sky melt from gold to crimson to deep indigo. Maybe he stayed until the first stars emerged, bright, sharp, unmarred by city haze. You picture him staring at the Milky Way stretching overhead like a spilled river of light. A quirky fringe fact: interior Alaska offers some of the darkest, clearest night skies in the world. On moonless nights, The Milky Way looks close enough to touch. You let that image settle behind your eyes. Then, in your mind, the sky brightens with something even more spectacular. The aurora. You stand perfectly still, imagining the sudden flicker of green across the horizon. It grows, it curls, it twists in ribbons and drapes that sway like living fabric. Blues and purples shimmer through it. The aurora ripples overhead, silent but impossibly alive. Imagine him, watching this alone. No camera, no crowd, no applause, just the sky performing for him and the lake below. Historians still argue whether auroras were more awe-inspiring or frightening to early wilderness residents. Some journals describe them as breathtaking. Others call them unnerving or otherworldly. But you know the truth. Beauty that powerful hits somewhere deep, deeper than language. You swallow softly, suddenly aware of tears warming the corners of your eyes, not sadness, just awe. Joke number 2, murmured through a soft smile. Nature really said, "You know what? Let me flex a little." You stand for a long moment, letting the imaginary aurora drift across your mind's sky. And in this softened moment, you finally understand why he stayed. Not for pride, not for escapism, not for stubbornness. He stayed for this. For quiet mornings by the lake, for sunlit moss, for moonlit nights, for auroras that felt like whispered secrets, for moments when the world seemed impossibly large and impossibly gentle at the same time. You take a breath, slow and steady. The beauty of this place wasn't decoration, it was nourishment. And sometimes, maybe more often than people realize, beauty can become a reason to keep going. Joke number 3 slips out softly as you turn back toward the forest. Okay, Alaska. Fine. You're gorgeous. Stop showing off. You step forward, letting the glow fade gently from your thoughts. Because next comes something even deeper than beauty. Why leaving this place became harder than staying. You step slowly away from the ridge, letting the imagined aurora fade behind your eyelids like the last glow of a dream. The forest closes gently around you again, not menacing this time, almost welcoming. And as you take a few more steps, you begin to understand something he learned gradually, quietly, and almost against his own intentions. Leaving becomes harder than staying. Not because the wilderness was easy, not because he stopped missing people, not because he became some mythic, unshakable survivalist. It was simpler and stranger than that. The wilderness changed him. You follow the narrow, soft path back toward the lake, brushing your fingers against spruce needles, feeling their cool, fragrant texture. When you first imagined arriving here, everything felt enormous, too big, too quiet, too wild. But now the land feels familiar, not tamed, not predictable, but familiar in the way a deeply loved neighborhood becomes familiar. You know the way the wind moves, you know the rhythm of the lake, you know the creak of certain trees as they sway. He knew those things too, knew them so well that eventually the land felt less like a setting and more like a companion, one he didn't want to abandon. One mainstream psychological fact: long-term isolation combined with stable routines and consistent surroundings can create deep attachment to place. Not sentimental attachment, neurological attachment. Your brain starts treating the land as part of your safety structure. Leaving it feels like tearing out a foundation post. You walk toward the clearing where his cabin once stood. The foundation logs are still there, sunk slightly into the earth, mottled with moss. You step onto one, balance on it, and look around. This spot, this simple patch of land, was his home for 30 years. Not the cabin, the place. The smell of smoke in winter, the shape of the hills, the way the stars aligned above the lake, the feel of the cold biting his cheeks in January. You understand something profound. People don't just adapt to the wilderness. The wilderness adapts to them too, in a quiet, invisible way. You imagine him sitting on the cabin steps after 20 years out here, sipping something warm, watching the sun slide behind the mountains. That moment so simple would have felt impossibly rich. After that long, the idea of going back to a world of calendars, conversations, traffic and noise must have felt overwhelming. Artificial, loud, unreal. Historians still argue whether he stayed because of contentment or because returning to society felt too foreign. But based on every wilderness journal ever written by long-term hermits, the truth is usually both. Home becomes the place where your heartbeat slows. And this wild, lonely stretch of Alaska eventually slowed his heartbeat in all the right ways. You kneel beside the mossy log, brushing it gently. You imagine memories layered into this earth, like tree rings, years stacked upon years. Early years filled with uncertainty, mistakes, cold nights spent second-guessing everything. The middle years spent refining routines, mastering the land, settling into silence. The later years, quieter still, more reflective, more rooted. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some wilderness dwellers report the moment of crossing over, when solitude stops feeling like isolation and starts feeling like identity. A psychological shift where the land becomes so intertwined with self that you no longer think about the wilderness, you think with it. You take a slow breath and realize you're starting to feel that shift too, even in imagination. You walk toward the tree line, noticing how your steps have become softer, more deliberate. You don't stomp or rush the way people do in cities. You place your feet carefully, instinctively avoiding twigs and dry leaves. Wilderness residents often describe this change. Your body rewires its habits to match the quiet. You pause beneath a tall spruce, its branches fanning overhead like the ribs of a massive umbrella. A breeze rustles through, whispering with a kind of intimate familiarity. You imagine him standing here on countless mornings, listening to that same whisper, knowing from the sound whether a storm was coming or whether it would be a calm day. That kind of intuition doesn't travel well. You can't bring it into a grocery store or office lobby. You keep walking, following a faint deer trail. The path curves gently around a patch of blueberries. The bushes sway lazily in the wind, and you smile because you can imagine him picking berries here year after year, season after season. The land wasn't just landscape, it was his calendar, his pantry, his storybook. And that's what made leaving hard. He didn't just live in this place. He belonged to it, and it belonged to him. You picture him standing at the water's edge on rare reflective evenings, thinking about the world beyond this quiet valley. Maybe he wondered whether he could still fit into that world, whether he wanted to, whether returning would feel like stepping into a stranger's house. Joke number 1 slips out gently. Honestly, after 30 years, even ordering a pizza might feel like an overwhelming social event. You laugh softly, the sound swallowed by the forest. You move toward a cluster of boulders warmed by the sun and sit, letting the imagined heat seep into your palms. You picture him resting here too, thinking about his past life, the city noise he once knew, the people he once spoke to. In the early years, he probably missed it. In the middle years, he probably forgot parts of it. In the later years, he probably couldn't imagine going back. Historians still debate whether solitude rewired his brain permanently, whether he stayed because he wanted to, or because he no longer knew how to return. But when you sit in this clearing, surrounded by soft wind and ancient trees, you suspect it wasn't fear that kept him enramained here. It was peace. A peace so complete and so rare that once he tasted it, nothing else felt real. You stand again, brushing the dirt from your palms, and begin walking back toward the lake. The water sparkles gently, rippling with the afternoon breeze. You can almost feel how leaving this behind would have felt like ripping out a piece of himself he couldn't replace. Joke number 2 whispers up as you squint across the water. Imagine going from this to hearing car alarms again. Hard pass. You shake your head and smile. Then another thought surfaces. A deeper one. He did sometimes see people, and each encounter challenged the quiet world he built. Each one tested the identity he had grown into, and each one reminded him how fragile solitude really is. Joke number 3, as you turn toward the forest path. All right, time to talk about visitors. The surprise boss fight moments of wilderness living. Because now comes the next piece of his story. The rare humans who crossed his path and what it felt like when their footprints appeared on his snow. You follow the narrow deer trail away from the lake, letting the trees close in around you again. The forest here feels different, denser, quieter, as if holding its breath. You step over a fallen branch, feeling the soft crunch beneath your boot, and for a moment, you try to imagine what it would feel like to live in a place where seeing another human being was an event, not a nuisance, not a routine, an event. Because out here, human footprints in fresh snow meant something big had changed. You keep walking until the trees open slightly into a thin corridor of filtered light. You stop. Listen. Let the imagined forest settle around you. For years, whole seasons, he didn't hear another voice, didn't see another face, didn't exchange a single word with another person. And then, one day, someone would appear. Unexpected, unplanned, unbelievably loud in a world built from silence. You imagine, the first time it happened. Maybe he was cutting wood. Maybe he was checking the shoreline. Maybe he was inside the cabin, stoking the morning fire, when suddenly voices, not wind, not animals, voices, human ones, sharp, fast, filled with a kind of background noise the wilderness never makes. Your heart pounds at the idea, and it wasn't even your visitor. One mainstream fact: in remote Alaska, the only way most people arrived was by float plane, canoe, or long overland trek. So if someone reached him, it usually meant they had a purpose, a delivery, a check-in, or simply curiosity about the man living alone on a distant lake. These weren't drive-by visits. They were rare, meaningful interruptions. You walk toward a large spruce and lean against it, feeling the bark press into your back. You imagine him watching a float plane descend in the distance, its soft buzz growing louder until it filled the entire valley, an alien sound after months of nothing but natural noise. You imagine him stepping outside, hand shading his eyes, unsure whether to wave or hide. He chose differently each time. Sometimes he greeted them warmly, sharing dried fish, offering tea, talking about weather patterns and the migration of birds. Other times he kept his distance, answering questions politely, but with the soft, measured tone of someone whose voice wasn't used to human conversation. Historians still argue whether he appreciated these visits or simply tolerated them, but the journals hint at both. A quirky fringe tidbit: some long-term hermits reportedly practiced speaking aloud before visitors arrived, just to make sure their voice didn't crack from underuse. You smile at the image, him clearing his throat, muttering test sentences like, "Ah yes, hello, person who is not a squirrel." You step from the spruce and continue down the path until you reach a gentle rise overlooking the lake. Here, you imagine one of his most memorable encounters, the day a group of hikers stumbled into his clearing by sheer accident. Maybe they were following a map. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were chasing some rumor of the man who lives alone. You picture their astonished expressions when they saw smoke curling from his chimney, a cabin that wasn't on any official map, a man stepping out of the door who looked like he had been carved by winter itself. And then you picture his expression: surprise, amusement, maybe a flicker of discomfort, maybe a flicker of joy. Because human contact, no matter how rare, no matter how unexpected, always hits the same deep switch inside: recognition. You imagine him offering them water from the lake, maybe sharing a small piece of smoked fish, maybe answering their questions in the patient, careful way of someone who speaks slowly not because he's unsure, but because he's not used to being rushed. You smile softly, letting the scene play out in your mind. Then you imagine the other kind of visit: not hikers, not curious passers-by. Those quiet, formal visits from rangers or bush pilots checking in, ensuring he was still alive, still healthy, still capable of the lifestyle he chose. These visits were rare, but more official. You picture him standing outside his cabin with his arms folded, listening carefully, nodding as they asked predictable questions. Enough food? Any injuries? Roof holding up? Need anything flown in? And every time, he probably smiled and said something like, "Doing fine," whether he truly was or not. Joke number one floats softly out of you. Imagine answering, "How have you been?" with 30 years of context. You keep walking through the imagined landscape, following where the trail dips toward a rocky outcrop. Here, the land overlooks the lake in a way that feels like a natural lookout point. You stand at the edge, imagining him sitting here after visitors left, watching the ripples on the water calm slowly after the float plane took off. Because after every visit, no matter how welcome or pleasant, something always lingered. A disturbance, a memory, a tiny fissure in the deep solitude he lived inside. Not a bad fissure, just noticeable. Historians still debate whether these visits anchored him emotionally or destabilized him. Did they remind him of the world he left behind? Did they spark longing? Did they spark dread? Or did they simply pass through him like wind through pine needles, heard briefly, forgotten quickly? You take a breath, listening to the wind. You can almost hear the faint echo of a departing plane, a quirky fringe observation from other hermits. After human contact, the wilderness feels louder. Birds seem more talkative. Leaves rustle more dramatically. The mind readjusts to silence slowly, like eyes adjusting to darkness after bright light. You feel that now, the sense of needing to recalibrate. You glance down and spot a cluster of footprints in the soft earth. Yours, of course. But you imagine how jarring it must have felt to see other footprints in his snow. Evidence of someone walking through his world, disrupting patterns he had memorized. Joke number 2 comes out gently. Honestly, if I saw 2 sets of footprints after 30 years, I'd assume it was a boss fight. You laugh quietly, but the truth behind the joke settles in. Visitors were rare. Visitors were strange. Visitors were reminders. They reminded him of a life he once lived. They reminded him of choices made and roads not taken. They reminded him that solitude wasn't permanent unless he chose it to be. And yet, every time the plane flew away, every time the hikers left, every time the voices faded and the forest reclaimed the silence, he stayed. Not because he couldn't leave, but because the wilderness had become his world, his identity, his truth. You take one more step toward the lake, letting the wind brush your cheek. Joke number 3 slips out. At least nobody ever showed up, selling extended warranties. You smile softly, because now, with visitors fading into memory, it's time to step deeper into his mind, into the quiet philosophy he carried through 3 decades of solitude. Not the tasks, not the seasons, not the repairs, the meaning he carved from being alone. You stand at the cliff's edge a moment longer, letting the imaginary float plane fade into the horizon of your mind. The lake settles, the wind quiets, even the forest seems to exhale. And in that softened space, something new rises, something quieter than silence, deeper than solitude, older than any cabin beam or hand-carved tool. This is where his philosophy lived, not written in his journals, not spoken aloud, not even consciously formed. It was something that grew inside him over decades, a worldview shaped by cold mornings, quiet evenings, soft light on the lake, and the everyday miracle of surviving a place both harsh and gentle. You turn away from the cliff and start walking toward the trees, your footsteps soft, almost instinctively quieter than before. It's strange how imagining solitude begins to shape your behavior. You breathe slower, you look longer, you notice more, and that's exactly what happened to him. The wilderness rewrote how he thought. You reach a mossy patch of ground and sink to a crouch, brushing your fingers over the cool, springy surface. You imagine him doing the same, not because he needed moss for anything, but because living alone gives you a unique relationship with details. A small patch of moss becomes its own world, its color, its moisture, the tiny insects moving through it. He lived 30 years this way, attuned to the micro-landscapes most people overlook. One mainstream fact: long-term solitude slows cognitive tempo. People think more deliberately. They categorize experiences differently. They form meaning through patterns rather than events. You feel that now, letting your thoughts stretch like warm taffy. He probably didn't think of his life in dramatic arcs or chapters. He thought in cycles, in rhythms, in seasons, in the small rituals that stitched one day into the next. You rise again, letting your hand glide across a nearby spruce trunk. The bark is rough, familiar beneath your fingertips. You imagine him touching this same tree or one like it countless times, not because he needed to, but because it was there. A presence in his life, a constant. That's part of his philosophy. When you have so few things, each one becomes meaningful. You walk deeper into the clearing, stepping over an exposed root. The sunlight shifts in dappled patches across the forest floor. You can almost sense the thoughts he might have carried during long winter nights or warm summer dusks. Why do humans complicate their lives? Why do we crave more when enough is already miraculous? Why do we fear silence when it's the most honest sound in the world? Historians still argue whether solitude fosters wisdom or merely exposes the thoughts we've been too distracted to hear. But if you had asked him after 20 years here, he'd probably have shrugged and said something simple like, "It's quiet enough to think." And real thinking changes you. You continue walking until you reach a small natural bench of stone, shaped perfectly for sitting. You lower yourself onto it, imagining the weight of 30 winters and summers on his shoulders. You picture him sitting here after a long day of repair or hunting, watching ripples spread across the lake as his thoughts drifted freely. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some hermits claim that living alone makes the concept of time feel more round than linear. Days don't march forward, they circle, repeat, evolve. You feel that now, the sense of days looping like quiet tides. You close your eyes, letting the imagined lake breeze brush your face, and you realize something profound. When you strip away noise, people, deadlines, and distraction, your mind fills the space with what matters. He learned gratitude for simple things: a warm stove, a fish biting the line, a calm morning after a stormy night. He learned patience, not the performative kind, but the practical kind, born from waiting on nature instead of fighting it. He learned humility because the wilderness doesn't care about your plans or your pride. He learned clarity because silence is a mirror that doesn't lie. And he learned something modern society rarely lets people feel: enough. That he was enough. That this place was enough. That a simple day of working, eating, and noticing was enough. You open your eyes and exhale slowly. The air tastes crisp, clean, the kind of air that almost forces introspection. You stand once more and walk a few steps toward the lake. Your reflection wavers on the surface, faint and quiet. You imagine him standing here, seeing himself not as a castaway or outsider, but as part of the landscape, one creature among many, shaped by the same winters, warmed by the same summer sun. Joke number 1 slips out gently. Honestly, 30 years out here, and I'd start giving motivational speeches to trees. You smile, because humor isn't the enemy of philosophy, it's part of it. Humor keeps the mind grounded. You walk along the shoreline, letting stones crunch underfoot. And as the ripples spread outward, you think about the strange contradiction at the heart of his existence. He left the world to live alone, but in solitude, he found connection to land, weather, patterns, silence deeper than any crowd could offer. Historians still debate whether his lifestyle represented escape or transformation. But for him, it wasn't about rejecting humanity. It was about embracing a different kind of humanity, the quiet kind, the present kind, the kind not shaped by constant noise. You pause beside a sunlit boulder and lean against it. Another thought rises, gentle as mist. He didn't abandon life. He simplified it until he could hear it again. Joke number 2 softens the edge. Honestly, if everyone spent 1 week out here, group chats would suddenly get way quieter. You laugh softly. Then, as you turn back toward the imagined cabin site, one final truth settles in your chest. When you live alone long enough, you stop seeing solitude as empty. You see it as full of time, full of meaning, full of space to breathe. And eventually, that fullness feels more natural than the world you left behind. But even a life this steady, this intentional, this rooted, must eventually shift. Because after 30 years in the wild, one day arrived he didn't expect, the day he finally walked out. Joke number 3 murmurs as you take a step forward. All right, time to talk about the plot twist nobody saw coming. You walk slowly away from the boulder, each imagined step taking you closer, not to the cabin, not to the lake, not to the familiar hush of the valley, but toward a moment he probably replayed in his mind long before it happened. A moment that came quietly, without ceremony, without a storm or an accident or a dramatic turning point. Just a day like any other. And yet, somehow, the last one, the day he finally walked out. You enter the clearing again, pausing beside the moss-wrapped foundation logs. They sit like old bones, softened at the edges, sun-bleached, faithful remnants of the life he built board by board. You run your fingers along the surface again, almost reverently, and imagine him doing the same on that final morning, touching the corners of his world one last time, not because he regretted anything, not because he feared leaving, but because when you stay somewhere for 30 years, you don't walk away casually. You walk away like you're turning a page. You spent half a lifetime writing. You imagine dawn gently lifting through his cabin window that last day. Pale light, cold air, a stove still glowing faintly with coals from the night before. Maybe he sat up slowly, joints creaking with age. Maybe he murmured a simple greeting to the cabin out of habit, something like, "Morning." And the cabin, as always, answered with soft cracks and faint warmth. One mainstream fact, after decades, his health had started to change. Stiffer knees, a bit less stamina, a little more caution with every step. Even seasoned wilderness residents eventually reach a point where the land becomes harder to negotiate. It wasn't defeat. It was reality. You imagine him folding his bedding neatly, rolling it with that practiced efficiency solitude teaches. He wouldn't rush. This wasn't a hurried evacuation. It was a prepared departure, one he likely pondered through dozens of quiet evenings by the stove. You walk toward where the cabin door once stood. The threshold is gone now, reclaimed by roots and moss. But you picture him standing there, pack on his shoulder, hands resting on the doorframe, taking one long, steady breath. Historians still argue whether that decision came suddenly or slowly. His journals shift subtly in those final months. Fewer reflections, more observations about difficulty, fatigue, repairs that took longer than they used to. Not despair, not sadness, just awareness. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some long-term hermits describe their final months as a softening, when daily tasks start to feel heavier and the wilderness begins nudging them gently toward change. Almost like the land itself knows when it's time. You step away from the imagined doorway and walk toward the tree line. He likely took this same route. The softest path, the one that skirted the lakeshore, curved past the fallen spruce, and dipped gently toward the rocky ridge. You try to picture him pausing here, looking back over his shoulder. 30 years reflected in the still water. 30 years of storms, of silence, of auroras. 30 years of growing roots deeper than most people ever feel. And now he was leaving. Not fleeing, not escaping. Just taking his final walk across ground he knew better than his own reflection. You move to the ridge and stand where he might have stopped. The sky is bright in your imagination. Maybe midsummer. Fireweed just beginning to climb its stalk. The lake calm, almost holding its breath. He would have looked down at the cabin one last time. He would have listened for the familiar sounds, ravens calling, wind brushing spruce needles, waves tapping the shore. He would have felt the air on his skin and thought, "This has been home longer than anything else in my life." Joke number 1 slips softly out of you. "Honestly, I'd need at least 3 hours to say goodbye to my favorite tree alone." You smile, but there's a weight behind the humor. You imagine him adjusting his pack that probably felt foreign after so many years without needing to carry everything he owned. He didn't have much. A few tools, his journals, a pot, a knife, some dried food, maybe a carved keepsake or two. And then he stepped forward. You follow the imagined path with him, step by step, the earth soft beneath your boots, the light breaking between the trees, birds scattering as you pass. A forest that has watched over you for decades, now watching you go. Historians still debate how emotional that walk was for him. His journals don't spill dramatic confessions or tearful recountings. But that's the nature of solitude. You learn to feel things quietly, deeply, privately. You walk farther, hearing your own phantom footsteps echo in your mind. For him, those echoes must have been startling. His cabin was the quiet he controlled. The outside world held sounds he hadn't heard in so long they felt alien. The buzz of a plane engine growing louder, the chatter of voices, drifting toward him, the metallic clatter of gear being unloaded. You imagine his face when he reached the lake's edge and saw that float plane waiting. A mix of acceptance and nostalgia. Maybe a little reluctance. Maybe a little relief. Joke number 2 murmurs out of you. "If I lived here for 3 decades, even the plane would look too loud." You step into the clearing and feel the imagined wind of the plane's propeller. You picture him setting his pack down, turning once more to face the tree line, and then stepping into the plane. The moment the engine roared to life must have felt like a small earthquake. After 30 years of silence, that sound would have shaken something inside him loose. As the plane lifted off, water spraying in arcs behind the pontoons, the entire valley shrank beneath him. The cabin, the lake, the clearing, the paths he carved with his own footsteps, all of it getting smaller, all of it slipping beneath the wings, all of it becoming memory. Historians still argue whether he watched until the last possible moment or closed his eyes halfway through. But one thing is certain. When he left, he didn't just leave a place. He left a version of himself. Joke number 3 arrives quietly, softened by the moment. And that, folks, is the longest move-out day in history. You breathe in deeply, letting the valley shrink behind you in your mind. Because now there's only one chapter left. What 30 years of silence leaves behind, both in the wilderness and in the man who walked out of it. You keep walking along the imagined shoreline in your mind, the plane's distant hum fading until it becomes nothing more than a faint tremble in the sky. The lake settles, the forest exhales, and you're left standing in the quiet valley, his valley, knowing he will never return to it. The stillness feels different now. Not the comfortable, companionable quiet he lived with for decades. This one feels like an empty room after someone has taken their last suitcase out the door. This is what 30 years of silence leaves behind. And it's more than footprints, more than cut logs, more than an old cabin returning slowly to moss and memory. It leaves an imprint on the land and an imprint on the man. You step into the clearing, imagining how the wilderness must have reacted to his absence. The paths he once walked begin to soften, their edges blurred by summer grass and winter snow. The places he touched, logs he sat on, stones he stood beside begin to fade back into the larger pattern of the forest. Nature is patient. Nature reclaims. And the cabin, once filled with smoke, warmth and quiet work, slowly collapses inward like a sigh. One mainstream fact: abandoned frontier cabins rarely last more than a few decades. Harsh winters crush the roofs, moisture swells the logs, moss eats the foundations. Within 50 years, most disappear entirely. That's happening here too, even in your imagination, weather smoothing away every trace of human hands. But the land holds memory differently than humans do. It doesn't romanticize. It doesn't mourn. It simply absorbs. You kneel near the old foundation, letting the weight of that settle. He didn't build a monument here. He didn't leave statues or carvings or trophies. What he left behind was something quieter, a kind of imprint in the way the space feels. An echo of daily work, a ghost of routine, the faint, lingering sense that someone once lived gently with the land, not against it. You stand again and wander toward the tree line, imagining how he changed once he left. After 30 years of silence, stepping into the loud, busy, modern world must have felt like stepping into a storm. Voices everywhere, engines rumbling, doors slamming, clocks ticking, screens flashing, conversations overlapping. All the things most people consider normal would have felt like an avalanche of noise. Historians still argue whether he struggled with the transition, but nearly all long-term wilderness dwellers describe the same shock. Sound becomes overwhelming, crowds become foreign, and the pace of society feels hectic, even chaotic. He probably felt that too. The strangeness of roads, the sharpness of city lights, the confusing abundance of choices. After living so long with so little, too much becomes a real sensation. You picture him sitting indoors somewhere, maybe a visitor's cabin, maybe a small apartment, hearing a refrigerator hum for the first time in decades, feeling the soft vibration of a heater, listening to voices through walls, hearing the muted thud of footsteps in a hallway. Everyday sounds most people ignore would have seemed impossibly loud. You walk toward the lake again, imagining him remembering this place while adjusting to that new world. The scent of spruce, the taste of cold air, the hiss of snow on the stove, the quiet splash of a fish at dawn, the way the aurora unfurled across the sky like silk. A quirky fringe tidbit: many long-term hermits report phantom wilderness sensations after returning to society, feeling wind patterns on their skin even indoors, waking at dawn automatically, dreaming of open sky. Solitude leaves its fingerprints deep. Joke number 1 slips out softly. Honestly, after 30 years out here, even a grocery store would feel like Las Vegas. You smile, but the truth is gentle and serious beneath the joke. You step farther across the clearing, imagining the emotional side of his return. People probably asked him questions he didn't know how to answer. Weren't you lonely? Why did you stay so long? Weren't you scared? What did you do all day? Questions built from a life different from his, a life of schedules, buzz, connection, interruption. But he probably answered simply, honestly, in the straightforward way solitude taught him. And maybe his answers didn't fully make sense to anyone but him. You reach the tree line and place your hand on a spruce trunk. It feels like touching memory itself. You take a slow breath and imagine how he must have felt looking back on his own life. 30 years alone. 30 years with silence, storms, animals, seasons. 30 years learning the rhythm of a wild place until it felt like part of his own heartbeat. He didn't leave behind wealth or fame or monuments. He left behind something harder to describe. A lived proof that a human life can become quiet, deliberate, stripped of excess, shaped entirely by nature, and still be full. Joke number 2 comes quietly. Honestly, his life was the ultimate minimalist flex. You walk one last time to the water's edge, the lake gleaming softly. The breeze lifts, the trees whisper, and you realize something gentle and profound. He left the wilderness, but the wilderness never left him. It lingered in his habits, his speech, his calm, in the way he measured time, in the way he noticed small things. in the way he breathed. You inhale deeply, letting that truth settle over you, and it feels like a closing chapter. And now, as the last ripples fade on the imagined lake, it's time for the soft descent, the slow unwinding, the quiet drift into rest that he knew so well after long days of living simply. Time for your wind down. The light softens around you now, the edges of the forest blurring into gentle shapes. The lake, once bright with reflections, grows still and smooth, taking on the muted colors of early dusk. You let your shoulders ease, letting the cool, steady air flow in and out at its own unhurried pace. There's no need to walk anymore, no tasks to finish, no sounds to track, just this soft, lingering quiet, the kind that settles around your thoughts like a warm blanket, the kind he must have felt, night after night, as he sat by the stove with nothing but the settling cabin and the distant whisper of wind for company. You linger here a moment, letting that softness loosen the last bits of tension you didn't even realize you were holding. The trees sway slightly, their movements slow and rhythmic, like the world breathing with you. The lake glimmers faintly under the dimming sky, its surface smoothing out until it looks almost like silk stretched tight. Your thoughts drift, gently now, like leaves riding the surface of the water. No destination, no urgency, just movement softened by time. The air is cool, calming, quiet. Every sound, real or imagined, grows slower, quieter, more distant. Even your heartbeat feels unhurried. You imagine stepping into the cabin one last time. The warmth, the dimness, the simple comfort of stillness. A place where rest feels natural, easy, earned. You let that image guide you as you settle even deeper, drifting with the pace of the wilderness around you. No need to reach any conclusion, no need to hold on to anything. Just let the calm spread through your chest, down your arms, across your body, like a warm wave. And when you're ready, let yourself drift.